and giving them the space to speak and giving them that honor that God has given them. You know, as Muslims, we believe that God has created everyone equally, regardless of skin color. And the only thing that God will judge us is based on our piety and our deeds. So it is incumbent on us as people of faith to work together to bring about these changes that are so necessary for us to live, all of us, in dignity, to make sure that we're giving the rights of who we are as people of faith to those around us. And it doesn't matter where they're from. It doesn't matter, because again, we're all created by that one God that loves us, that cares for us, that wants us to be good to one another. And, you know, we want to be of those who are successful in that, because if we're living in a good life and we're living under a roof and we have food to feed our children, there's so many people who are not living in that. And that's unfair for us to think that we should only worry about ourselves. So our work is not just to pray, it's to actually physically do the work too. So I'm honored to be here today and to speak. If you guys have any questions, you can let me know later. But I want to thank Betsy so much for having me here today and to talk a little bit about the work I've been doing and what it means for people of faith to actually take action and coincide that with the words that we're actually speaking. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Horonessa. Thank you, Loretta, her daughter, Consuela, Katina, her niece, for helping me, and also to bring this story, this powerful story to us. And for Horonessa, thank you for bringing the ways that we find that the Adams Center brings meaning and action to the issues of today. I'd like to end this portion of honor with a poem. The poem is by Adrienne Rich. My heart is moved by all I cannot save. So much has been destroyed. I have to cast my lot with those who age after age, perversely and with no extraordinary power, reconstitute the world.
Thank you, Betsy. Thank you, Horonessa. I think we've all been moved by the stories that we've heard and inspired by Horonessa's ideas about how to make the world a better place. I know we're thinking about the need to acknowledge and honor the sacrifices of so many people. Betsy reminded us of those stories. Now we're going to turn to John Whitley, who's going to help us identify and recognize the heroes who, often unseen by the public, are doing the work of creating the beloved community every day. John is a member of the board of the Virginia Interfaith Center for Public Policy, and he's an activist who's fought on the side of racial and economic justice for decades. John?
Thank you, Karen. We live in a world in which we need to share responsibility. It's easy to say, it's not my child, not my community, not my world, not my problem. Then there are those who see the need and respond. I consider those people my heroes. Mr. Rogers said those words. Why do people step forward, often risking their own safety and well-being, to help us navigate the COVID-19 and rampant racism pandemics? How do we ensure doctors, nurses, hospital workers, first responders, faith leaders, teachers, demonstrators, organizers, and others receive the support they deserve? What do we do to acknowledge their work and engagement? Heroes are influencers. They place themselves in situations where their presence illustrates the essence of who they are. Unconditional love and unlimited compassion guide their commitment to stand up, speak up in the face of probable success and possible failure. in the face of limited resources and devastating realities, and in confrontation with brutal reactions of those who should be allies. They serve each moment with a clear vision and a commitment to build the beloved community. I present to you two folk who are my heroes. Tara Hassan Taylor is a community activist for family and domestic justice. Jonette Weaver is a community activist for racial justice. They are two of the most influential and powerful persons I know. Their presence causes others to join their good work. They believe in good trouble. Every single day, they work to create beloved community in this wounded world. Welcome, Tara.
Hi, thank you. So, good morning. As John told you, I'm Tara Hassan Taylor, and I am a wife to a very sweet man. I'm a very tired stay-at-home mom of 4 children, 10 and under, 3 girls, 1 boy. And they all happen to be virtually learning in my home, so please expect visitors as I give this talk to you. I am an Iranian American. I've spent the majority of my life right here in Yorktown. I serve as the state city gun violence lead for Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America. I'm the membership chair for our local NAACP, and I am the first vice chair of the York-Poquoson Democratic Committee. As we concentrate on understanding the 2 life-threatening pandemics we are dealing with, COVID-19 and rampant racism, I want to talk about our community members that have chosen life-saving work as their career, but also the very necessary everyday heroes that may not have known they would be on the front lines, but showed up to work anyway. While we know careers like doctors, nurses, mental health professionals are chosen career paths for helping and saving people's lives, some very unlikely heroes have also come through. When John asked me to speak about this, I started taking notice of all the places with the heroes' work signs outside. So many places that never occurred to me. I started to reflect on the people that are the unlikely heroes of this pandemic. The people who many times had no intention of putting their lives in danger for work, but rose to the occasion. The teenagers working in grocery stores, our postal workers, Dominion Power linemen, school teachers and support staff, pharmacists filling our prescriptions, food service workers, and so many others. So what type of people are drawn to this life-saving work, willing or unwillingly? Why do they continue in the face of adversity? How can they be supported by their communities? And why do some people have a servant's heart? For me, I think it came from my parents. My father's a retired doctor. He's a Muslim, immigrated to this country to finish medical school, and my mother was a nun in a nursing convent until she found my handsome med student father in a hospital in Brooklyn, New York. They are selfless, they are kind, they're helpers, and I believe I learned it from them. All of these are very, very real, very deserving everyday heroes. But what about the other heroes of this pandemic? The everyday heroes that don't get paid, the ones trying to educate their children and keep their jobs, the ones trying to hold their family together and hold themselves together, the ones trying to be school teacher, principal, and tech support all wrapped up in one. School teachers who are trying to teach our children while still needing to educate their own. The biggest unsung heroes of this pandemic are women. The disproportionate effect on women as the de facto caretakers is almost too much to comprehend. So many women are tired. So many women need support. And so many women need a beloved community that doesn't exist for them anymore, especially Black women. Almost 30% of Black males will see a prison, most before they're 20 years old, as compared to about 5% of their white male counterparts. 6 times as many Black men are in prison as white, and Black people are 5 times more likely to be arrested than white people. but they make up just 12.9% of our population. What do all these numbers boil down to? They boil down to institutional racism. Racism so embedded in a society that it can lead to disparities in criminal justice, employment, housing, healthcare, political power, education, and the list goes on. But it also leads to women without their beloved communities. Women in need, women who desperately want 1 second to themselves, but are the only caretaker and moneymaker for their children. How do we go to work and homeschool our children? How do we stay home and not spread a virus when we don't have paid sick leave? And how do we keep showing up to raise our families when we can barely hold ourselves up anymore? Audre Lorde said, "I am not free while any woman is unfree, even when her shackles are much different than my own." My 7-year-old son is autistic. Virtual learning for him has been, we'll just say difficult, to say the least. I was checking on another mom with a child with special needs. She's a social worker here locally. Her husband is a school teacher in York County for high school. I think he teaches chemistry. And her son has Down syndrome. He's in 5th grade. She sits on the computer in virtual school with him all day long, and then stays up half the night to finish her own work because her husband's busy teaching other people's children during the day. Then she sleeps a few hours. When we were commiserating over virtual learning for differently abled kids, she said, "We wake up every day and we do it again. Heroes wake up, heroes keep going, and heroes raise tiny activists that will build more beloved communities for others, because that is how we save the world." I want to close with a poem that is one of mine and my daughter's favorites. It's by a woman named Caitlin Shelter, and it's called Bubble Wrap. It makes me think of how I want to wrap my daughters up in bubble wrap and protect them from all the ugly, but raising tiny activists and strong, smart women is how the next generation builds their beloved community and becomes the next group of everyday heroes. My daughter said God was a man because the back cover of her Bible told her so. She can't read, but pictures say 1,000 words, most of them masculine. No matter how hard I try, I can't figure out how to navigate this world. It spins on an axis of injustice and oppression, and I don't know how to help her stand steady while I keep falling down. I want to cloak her in privilege and bubble wrap, and protecting her means endangering others, and I think I remember a God who preached against that. There are other gods, they tell me. We put them on the back of your Bibles. They're white and male and full of insulation, but I don't want her sick from exposure to a synthetic theology, and I need her to understand that their white male God is really ego, and white male ego is really dangerous, and no amount of bubble wrap will protect her from that. White men are ripping wombs out of brown women without their consent, and white women are praising Jesus while it happens. And I need to know what Bible that's in so I can burn it before she finds out, and soon I'll be replacing our sacred text with blank paper so she can draw the right God. But for now, I'll keep teaching her that falling down is better than falling in line, and the only true pictures of God are found in the wombs of brown women and not the words of white men. Thanks, John. You're muted still, John.
Gotcha. I need all the help I can get. Thank you, Tara. That was absolutely powerful. Friends, please stop just for a moment of reflection and response. Think of those persons about whom Tara has spoken as you see them in your life. See their faces. If you have paper and pen handy, write down their names. Now, in the quietude of your sanctuary, where you are at this moment, say aloud their names. If you don't know their names, reach out and let them know you care. Welcome, Jeanette.
Thank you, John. Good morning, everyone, and I thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. I am Jeanette Gordon-Weaver. I am the current media coordinator for Williamsburg Action. I'm a former board member for All Together, a former board member for Williamsburg's Community Action Agency. I said all that to say that for years, I have worked in an advocacy capacity in my community of Williamsburg, Virginia, to make a better place and a better community for all children.
Jeanette, did you wish for your video to be on?
No, I didn't. I just turned it back on. Bear with me.
Yes.
It is my belief that in building this beloved community in a better way in this wounded world, we need to recognize a few things. We need to recognize that in this land of the free, that we're not really free until racism is eradicated. We need to recognize that until the home of the brave is brave enough to make changes, we're not really free. We need to recognize that until this government that claims to be by the people, for the people, and of the people includes all people, it's not the American dream. We need to recognize that justice right now just is not just, and that Lady Liberty really isn't blind. She's just wearing a blindfold. Heroes who work in the area of civil rights and social justice recognize all of these things. It is no coincidence, I think, that when John approached me to have this chat with you all, I had just lost one of my heroes. Her name was Mary Esterine Moyler. She was my aunt. Mary Moyler was 88 years old when she passed away 2 weeks ago. She had toiled for a long, long time in the community of Williamsburg. She had been dislocated from her home in Magruder, which was a Black township that was taken over by the government by eminent domain and is now known as Camp Perry. She moved into a neighborhood called Highland Park in Williamsburg, which is a predominantly Black neighborhood, and she lived there her entire life. She was the head of the neighborhood association. She was a member of the NAACP, and she was the very first woman of color to run for the city council in Williamsburg. That's no easy feat. She was also the longest serving election chief in Williamsburg. I did not know about her being the longest serving election chief. I knew she had done it for a long, long time, but hundreds of people came to let me know just how much that sticker lady meant to them. And I found it odd that they called her the sticker lady and didn't recognize everything else that she had done. And then I found out that we have local legends. Nobody recognizes what they have done. She's just one of my heroes. There's another. Her name is Clemenza Braxton. In education, we all know that there is disparity, there is an achievement gap, and we've been toiling forever to eradicate that. A long time ago, when I was in the 8th grade, which is a really long time ago, Mrs. Braxton noticed my zeal, my zest, and my desire to learn. She made sure that John Steinbeck and Ernest Hemingway, Emily Dickinson weren't the only writers that I knew about. She taught me about Langston Hughes, James Baldwin, Richard Wright, and many others, to make sure that I was receiving the education that I deserved and not just the one that the state mandated. But there are heroes in our lives and your lives every day. And I'm not just saying that just to point out that there are people that you touch and you know. I'm saying that because I want you to get to know who they are. I want you to enhance their lives. And there is a way to do that. If you're a parent or a grandparent who is white, have the talk with your children. It won't be the same talk that Black people have with their sons and daughters when they come of age to recognize that the world is not all that we think it should be. But your talk ought to incorporate why Black parents have the talk they have with their children. Your talk ought to let your children know that it's not right that the world isn't right for Black and brown children. Your talk ought to let your children know that their Muslim brothers and sisters are no different from they are. They happen to call God Allah as opposed to Yahweh or Jehovah. Your talk ought to incorporate the fact that just because a child's first language is not English doesn't make them any different. We all bleed the same blood. You can help in the fight for racism by recognizing these heroes by attending rallies and protests. You don't have to stay if you're full of fear. You can drop off water, and now that it's getting to be cool outside, you can bring coffee or cider. You can bring sanitizers or extra masks. You can be a part of a movement, and it is a movement. This is not a moment. America will not live up to the dream that she is supposed to be until all people are included in that dream, until that vision that we all share is something that can be spread from one coast to the other. You can support the mission and support the heroes that you know, not only by doing those things, but by mentoring them. If you are a senior, seasoned person who has personal experiences, share them with the young people of the day, because they are my heroes. Antonia Sanders, a young woman who leads Williamsburg Action. That's a name you're gonna get to know. Shanice Nicole, another young woman, a young woman of color, just 20 years old, is taking up the fight for 2 Black men out of Sussex County in Waverly, Virginia, who are falsely imprisoned. Everyone knows they didn't commit the crime. She's leading a rally November 4th. Support them in any way that you can. Make donations to those organizations. I'm gonna say the names of just a few of my personal heroes, all of whom happen to be 23 years of age or younger. Say their names with me. Napalo Cuelzo, who is the president of the Youth Coalition for Black Lives Matter of Greater New York. She's also the founder and CEO of Vote 2000. She marched in her first protest when she was 13 years old. She wore a hoodie to school that says, "Do I look suspicious?" Bria Baker, who's a recent Yale graduate, the former head of the NAACP campus of Yale, and who currently works for the Justice League in New York City. And one of my favorites, one of my personal heroes, is a young woman named Ziona Bryant was only 15 years old when she petitioned her local city council to take down the monument of Robert E. Lee in Charlottesville, Virginia. 1 year later, hundreds of white supremacists rallied to preserve that very statue, resulting in what we know to be a very violent and tragic day. Ziona's voice sparked a national conversation about what Confederate monuments like this one look like and represent in our modern culture, and how they have a lasting effect on lives of Black Americans. I submit to you that the dream is possible. Just reimagine how to fulfill it. I submit to you that one day, Lady Liberty, Lady Justice will take off that blindfold, and she will see us all as equals, as we should be. And finally, I will end with my favorite scripture, which is Matthew 5:16, which says to us, that we should let our light so shine amongst men that they can see our good work and glorify the Father which is in heaven. Let your good work be seen. Let your good work shine through, and let that light be a beacon unto us all. John, I thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Johnette. Friends, please stop for a moment of reflection and response. Think of those persons about whom Johnette has spoken as you see them in your life, as you see their roles in protest. Identify them. See their faces. If you have paper and pen handy, write their names. Now, in the quietude of your sanctuary, where you are this moment, say aloud their names. If you don't know their names, reach out and let them know you care. Let them know you care as you become a hero to others. We conclude remembering that heroes are committed to the worth and dignity of Mother Nature's creations. They are committed because they believe all those creations have special purposes. They understand the interconnectivity of every single entity. They know no creature is more special than any other. They know negative behaviors produce adverse effects. They know their presence influences others and outcomes, so they can continue working and speak out. What we do personally and through legislative initiatives are of ultimate importance to their presence and influence. Friends, we must be heroes. Heroes are committed to the worth and dignity of Mother Nature's creations. May we so be.
Thank you, John and Tara and Johnette. You've given us a lot to think about in your stories, the people you've raised up for us to hold as heroes are inspirational. Now, you've already heard from Anthony Fludd. He offered the prayer with which we began this symposium. But now he's going to facilitate a discussion of what it means for a community to be beloved, to be healthy in the deepest sense of the word. Anthony?
Are you on mute? Thank you, Karen. In our communities, we are faced with health issues that attribute to injustices and inequalities that add to unhealthy behavior and lifestyles. We need to wake up for just a moment to view some of the scenes and problems that are on the rise and are devastating to our communities. Then I want you to think about your definition of a healthy community.
No more back thinking, time for thinking ahead. The world has changed so very much from what it used to be. There's so much hatred, war and poverty. Wake up all the teachers, come to teach us the way. Maybe they'll never listen to what you have to say. They're the ones who's coming up, and the world is in their hands. When you teach the children, teach them the very best you can.
What do I think will bring about a healthy change in our communities? When we honor and prefer one another. We become our own inner heroes. If we wake up and listen with our hearts, we can bring about a change in our communities. What we believe becomes a lifestyle. All faiths depend upon a belief system that is rooted deeply in one's own conviction, that ultimately becomes the foundation for a better future, which is basic for spiritual transformation that yields a healthy community. It's obvious that our communities are lacking in compassionate, trusted leadership that ensures health equities are cultivated for the total well-being of our communities. Until our faith community and health leaders can recognize that the injustices of today warrants a critical approach for a collaborative effort that fosters services for all people to improve their health and well-being, we will not have a healthy community. Moreover, unless the interfaith community leadership advocates to be the voice that cries out and lead in the area of their gifting, nothing will happen. Nothing will begin, nothing will improve, and nothing will develop in providing provisions for persons underserved, and especially for those who fall among the at-risk populations. In times of this pandemic and other catastrophic events that result in devastating calamity. Listen, to remain stable and respected institutions, faith leaders must take on the helm of navigating to make a greater impact on the minds, the hearts, the souls of individuals, and to address that which is personal and of a social moral issue. Otherwise, redefining good health will never move out of the realm of just the absence of disease. Listen, good health now filters into a social justice mode and encompasses an even broader picture that now includes a behavioral attitude towards social medical policies, freedom from violent crimes, racist beliefs that breathe racial injustices, hatred, and economic, environmental injustice that hover over this past pathway with doubts and concerns of being educated to live a better lifestyle. And let me emphasize this. At this point, if we don't break out of this emaciated cycle, our community will continue to progress into a cycle that spirals out of control, leading to its demise. We must encourage real change in our lifestyles that will spark a desire to reform the internal and the external makeup of our community health systems. Leaders, whether they are health leaders or faith leaders, must recognize that the future of improvement concerning one health will come about only as people assume greater responsibility for their health and the health of their community. So let's wake up, be awakened, and work together. Good health is now more than just the absence of disease. It includes compassionate leadership, healthy living for everybody in the community. And for people of faith, above all, you are called to engage the holy work of building the beloved community. At this time, I would like to introduce to you Dr. Thomas Persky, who is the Associate Director of Heal the Sick program and filled the role of being an adjunct faculty member, as well as a former graduate of the Whitley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C., with a mission to prepare and educate and equip leaders to advance whole person health and well-being of individuals, communities, congregation, especially those who are underserved. Help me welcome Dr. Persky as he comes before us at this time. Dr. Persky, please unmute.
Thank you, Dr. Fludd. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and some slides. I just wanted to do a check on how much time I have.
I think you have lots of time, Dr. Persky.
Okay.
We're a little bit ahead of our schedule, so have at it.
Okay. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Great. All right. Well, thank you for that introduction and those powerful words, very prophetic. I first want to say that I've been involved with health ministry for over 20 years. And Dr. Fludd was a student of mine in the health minister certificate that we teach at Whitley Theological Seminary. And an important part of that certificate, which I'll get on a little later on in my presentation, is this fact of how do we know how to become a healthy community? How are we living that? How are we becoming that? And so an important piece is how are we defining our, hang on here. How are we defining that and looking at it? Okay, my slides aren't working here. There we go. So how you define health matters. And so our perspective of what a healthy person is and what a healthy community is extremely important. I think we've heard many stories today in regards to racism in the beloved community. I, as a white male, growing up in terms of or listening to in theology, most of the authors that I was in my theological education were part of European theological pieces. I am reading more James Lawson and other theological writers. Also Robert Jones, who wrote White Too Long, talking about in the Baptist tradition, some of these different perspectives of examining and seeing where racism is in our own lives, in our own stories, and creating space for voices that we heard so powerfully today in the other presentations on these personal experiences. I want to also bring this back in terms of health, looking at where we are now. I look at all these squares on my screen and recognize that each of you have your own story. You each have an experience of this. You each know probably someone else in those other squares that you see on Zoom, which is very, very important, and to look at that. Let's see here. So you're not seeing the slides. Hold on a second.
We're seeing your editing view still. The slideshow itself is not happening.
Thank you. I appreciate you stating that. Let me see if I can go ahead and get this going here. How's that? Is that better?
Nope. Oh, yes.
Perfect. Sorry about that. So a healthy person, as I was describing in the different squares, and everyone has a story. So if you see all the different folks on your screen right now, you can see that everyone has their own story and that we're connected by those stories. And we have to listen to those stories and understand each other, create that space. But we first have to see where racism is in our own lives, where health is defined in these different terms. Often, we look at, health is equated with healthcare and physical care. Well, for that, they're not the same. Health, as Dr. Fludd was talking about in his visual presentation, each of those folks who were on that picture had a different story and different circumstance. Our health system is really a sick care system. And you see that a large of the population is motivated. And then what I'm going to get into this is where education and motivation and values are. And a lot of our healthcare dollars are dedicated to the sickest populations. Well, you can see too that we weren't prepared for COVID in a lot of ways. And a lot of the way hospitals were set up were to deliver that compensated hospitals for elective procedures and other things. And so we weren't really prepared. Why do I put this slide up? I'm trying to show that we also have this analogy. Are we prepared as faith communities? So what is our language? What is the pieces that we talk about? You see the language of health and salvation. Here, you see reflection, sin, God, spirituality, healing tradition. When we preach on Sundays in our churches, are we connecting health to that message? You see all the other pieces, and this has become so evident during this pandemic even. And also in terms of looking at racism. We've all been quarantined to look inward and look at what's going on. What we want to look for is wholeness. What is the connections between these two worlds? How do we break down and listen to each other? So what are the dimensions of a whole person? I don't just mean this from a human perspective. I'm talking about environmental perspective. We see that the fires in California affect other people across the country. These are very, very important pieces. So you see physical, mental, social, spiritual, emotional, environmental. In Dr. King's piece, life is all interrelated. And so this is an important aspect, that something that happens somewhere in any part of the country, where an injustice happens somewhere, it affects everything. And so that's an important part of us understanding health also. So we have a long history of health ministry and evangelization, which I just want to quickly go over. In early Christian communities, there was a caring aspect. In biblical stories, there was stories and rituals attending to the whole person, numerous scriptural passages. Early Christian deaconesses, pastoral visitors, and healings were also part of the church's story. You have monastic orders, religious orders that were part of health and healing. You have religious orders, deaconesses, which led to our hospitals. Again, what is the root? What is the way that faith communities can take on health and healing now? Well, it is contemporary part of this health and healing is health ministers and faith community nurses. Here you see a neighborhood asset map, okay? And I'm going to really contextualize this in a way that helps us to see You see in the dotted line here that the first part, the primary building blocks, those are the key parts which a community needs to survive in. You see cultural, different organizations. The one part here, which I really want to point out, is that religious organizations are in the center of this, and that the assets that you can have and the influence you have, pastors can preach upon, being able to, it's our responsibility to go ahead and wear masks, go ahead and say that using a hand sanitizer for the benefit of our neighbor. This is a moral imperative for a lot of us to talk about this and saying it's a responsibility that we all share. This is another way to look at community health needs map. On the outer circle, you'll see the 10 leading causes of death. In the bottom right corner, you'll see pneumonia and influenza. Well, obviously, COVID, which is a virus, is included in that. And then you see in the inner circle, 9 actual causes of death. These are the things that, and you get into the inner circle, you look at 8 root causes of death. Let's take a little bit closer look at those. Those all affect spiritually what folks from faith communities can make an impact on. Internal, external stress, anger, frustration, powerlessness, low self-esteem, economic despair, hopelessness, lack of information. This, for instance, with public health and getting clear information. This can lead to a meaningless existence. So what I'm trying to show here and illustrate is that faith communities have a central role, with spirituality being the central part of health and whole person health, that is the central piece of what we need to address today. Dr. Thomas Droege did a lot of work. He's considered one of the key Christian theologians. He was Lutheran, and he was the associate director of the Interfaith Health Program in Atlanta in the 90s. He created this framework on faith and health, and he was one of the original founders of the Health Ministries Association, which is a national faith and health organization which has been around for over 30 years. What I wanted to highlight briefly for you today is that there's a collection of writings that he wrote on what are congregational aspects of their role in faith and health. He used a lot of Methodist pieces with John Wesley, looking at holistic health in this way. There are documents on interdisciplinary work between schools of theology and public health. So I left that link there, and I will send this to the organizers of the symposium so that you can take a look at more in depth this wide, voluminous collection that Dr. Droege wrote over the years. But I just wanted to highlight that. He also had an interesting perspective, Tom did, with the CDC director then, who's actually working on a lot of COVID approaches and how the vaccine will even be distributed. I'll get to that later, but I just wanted to mention Dr. Droege. So what are perspectives and ways that faith communities can work on this? You see all these different circles, all the ways that different aspects of society can work together: hospitals, public health, professionals. Now that we're in a virtual world where a lot of churches are also online, this becomes very difficult. We also, many of you are, I don't know whether or not you're still online or whether or not you've gone to in-person worship. I'm going to share some resources with you on that also, so that can help you and your faith community address where your role is. A lot of our speakers today have talked about putting our faith in action. Faith in deed that Dr. King talked about of enacting that for the beloved community. And so I'm really sharing resources here because as I see symposiums and different topics, I also listen to the one mother who shared the different experience of, I also have 2 children at home learning online. Another, my wife who's also online, like so many others, and the challenges that presents. Also frontline workers, or how do faith communities actively engage in, with being part of food pantry or the other services that they so necessarily are a part of and helping to feed communities also. These are important things that we should consider and do what we can to make an impact. So faith communities have a very active role in health. Here's a picture from, we worked in Inova Mount Vernon Hospital in Northern Virginia. This was a commissioning service, and you can see that different faiths are represented here, different beliefs. And we have a 22-hour certificate program at the seminary that I mentioned that Dr. Fludd was a part of. So our role as a seminary is to equip people for this work. And so we have United Methodist scholarships, full scholarships for United Methodists, but we've also partnered with different organizations such as hospital systems throughout the country. We've even had international students. Since COVID, we've had an online learning community where I host a Zoom every 2 weeks, and people share their different stories, just like the symposium. It's created relationships with people. We've shared different resources, which have helped each other in our context. Everything from mask making ministries, where 10,000 masks have been made for different communities, to how to reimagine faith community life in terms of COVID, in church reopenings. We've working on documents such as that. But the 22-hour certificate is a great way to look at your own health and wellness. I know many pastors who are under stress about trying to understand too how to open up their churches and do that in a safe and responsible way. And so this certificate is a 22-hour online experience, which has been done since 2017. It has 10 modules, and it goes on, it's held ongoing in spring, summer, and fall. And so if you or others are interested in taking this to learn more about health and wellness and equipping people in your faith communities, please do so. We've added a component of health minister mentors to help people learn how to implement health ministry. We've added pieces on how to use Zoom and different platforms, all that, to help and equip faith communities. This is a document too about resuming care-filled worship. Again, another link for all of you to be able to look at. This was convened by the U.S. Health and Human Services and CDC, and it's an ecumenical consultation, which is the best part about this document. It's a PDF, and so I hope that's a resource for many of you. You can take that and look at ways to, if you're considering online or opening up in person, a great document. I mentioned Dr. Droege. Well, this was the CDC director, William Fogey, who's now 84 years old, and they met each other at a theological and medicine conference. He was a CDC director, and obviously I'm showing, here on this slide that, in the past, he helped to eliminate smallpox, which was considered eradicated now. And so COVID also being a virus, it's very important to know that at 84 years old, he is still being consulted in these workings. And the reason why I'm showing you Dr. Fogey is we are looking for trusted voices, ones that we can consider. And I know that long history, especially with African Americans and the Tuskegee Airmen and all the other pieces, well, faith communities were an excellent source in eradicating smallpox because it was the trusted relationships and the use of the vaccine in those faith communities and a consistent message which helped to eradicate that. After the CDC, Dr. Droege worked with President Carter at the Interfaith Health Program in looking at ways that faith communities could be ways to impact health and the role of faith communities and developing wholeness in these pieces. This is a document which is just fresh off the press on equitable distribution of the vaccine. And the reason why I bring this out is because I've seen numerous webinars on, this is from the National Academy of Sciences, and Dr. Fogey, who was co-chair. This is a link to that document talking about equitable allocation of the COVID vaccine. And so we're going to be getting into this, not just preparing for when the vaccine, which has been highly politicized, but an important piece here is who are the folks that have been affected. And this is from the document page of key data that they list. And we all know this data that all our minority populations, Black, Hispanic, Latinx, Indian, Hawaiian, older adults, they have been disproportionately affected by COVID. And so they are one of the first populations that should get the vaccine. And so this is the phase of their equitable distribution that cuts across. Of course, you can dive into this a little bit more, but I wanted to provide this central document because, you know, we are looking also at these documents and saying, what can we trust? What can we get out? With the advocacy of this symposium and the interfaith group here, you have a voice to be able to speak to your communities, rural, suburban, a mixture of urban. And getting out this information to you from a trusted source is very important. Another piece that I found is that we sometimes don't see CDC or other organizations that we used to rely on, that this is the National Academy of Medicine, a nonprofit that put this out. And this will be a standard, hopefully, that will be adapted by the government. But I wanted just to get you some key pieces here of the best and most trusted, educated minds on looking at this. And you can see the most vulnerable populations in the beloved community that Dr. King talked about in phase 2, homeless shelters, people with comorbidity, critical high-risk workers, teachers. We talk about school staff that I mentioned earlier, people in jails, detention centers. And then you can see also in phase 3 and 4, the general population. Here is my contact information, but also where the link is for our program website. I also want to direct you to, there's a link to the certificate if you want more information about it. The other piece is this resource for faith communities related to COVID-19. As something that we have put together. I did not see a combined resource where there was best practice models for faith communities rather to participate or learn about. So there's a variety of ways that different faith communities or denominations have reopened. There is links about mental health resources. There is also different trainings and videos that can help prepare your faith communities about the virus. And so please visit that. There's my contact information. And we also share different stories, health ministry stories, on our Facebook page. Thank you very much. I don't know if there's any questions at all that people have, but thank you very much for allowing me to be part of this discussion.
Thank you so much for that informative and much needed discussion on how to take action and really build a faith community. I'm sure we can all apply that knowledge to build a better, beloved community. Thank you, Dr. Persky.
You're welcome. Thank you for the opportunity. It's a privilege to be part of this group and the work that you are all doing. Thank you.
Anthony, did you have anything else you wanted to say? You're muted.
Yes, I've said my final words. We are grateful for having Dr. Persky to provide the information so that we as a community, a beloved community, can take action. We are living in a serious time, and it's time for us to awaken and really get together and be proactive now, because there's going to be a whole lot of changes in our world, in our state, in our community. And if we don't have the information that we need to navigate through these difficult times, then we are going to be in a bad situation. But I thank you for this opportunity. I want to thank the Virginia Interfaith Center of Public Policy, whom I serve on the board as vice chair. And we are grateful for such a great chapter who is somewhat knowledgeable about the time that's upon us. It's very important that we be among people who have the knowledge to provide the vision and the insight so that we all can be a safe net to our neighbors and to each other. Bless you.
Thank you. Thank you. It seems like we're continuing to put more items on our list of things to think about. Thank you, Dr. Frisky. The chat box is full of requests to have copies of your slides. In addition to the contact information you gave us, would you be able to make those available to us? Okay, I don't know.
Yes, yes, I can do it. Sorry, I saw that it was still muted. I can make those available, and I will try to get them out to you immediately so they can be dispersed. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so now Dr. Fludd has told us about what's required to have a truly healthy community, and now Reverend Charles Swadley, retired United Methodist clergy and former interim CEO of the Virginia Interfaith Center for Public Policy, is going to lead a discussion about the hard work that is required for communities to heal, to move from brokenness to health. Charles? Are you there?
You have to let me on, Karen.
Oh, did I do something?
My camera won't come on.
All right, just a minute. Okay, there you go.
All right, thank you.
All right.
And I'm going to try to get down to speaker view if I can.
Yeah, we're good.
All right, good. Wow, it's been a powerful morning, and we're actually a little ahead of schedule right now. And I actually am in a position where I want to say thank you to all my colleagues. I'm grateful to their hard work in preparation for today. One of our members has reminded us that our labors of love as this planning team, we're in fact a building of the beloved community in a microcosm. We've all worked out many different things going on to make this happen, and I appreciate the extreme efforts that they've been given. Now, I also want to acknowledge the fact that I tried to recruit, or have recruited 3 persons to be on a panel to discuss the subject of healing. And they come from, I have one panelist who is in Guatemala, and one in Yorktown, Virginia, one in Richmond. Of the 3, one of them is now in the symposium. We're waiting for the other 2 to show up because we're a little bit early, and we're having some technical difficulties. So I'm hoping and praying that as we move along, they will join and will unmute and go into speaker mode, speaker vision, and we'll just take it from there. I want to thank Dr. Anthony Fludd, who proceeded with this challenging notion on health. He has enlarged that vision for the beloved community. Health has been a huge concern for our nation and the global community for most of this year. Our group is going to raise some questions about a different subject, about healing, which involves healing of our body and our spirit, both as a nation, as individuals, showing that we are created equally with dignity. We begin by remembering some whose dignity was not valued, however. Earlier in the honoring section, Betsy announced a few names of persons that only 3 weeks ago, on September 15th, we as a nation remembered the 57th anniversary of a terrible, jolting experience for our nation then. On September 15, 1963, in Birmingham, Alabama, 2 weeks after the famous "I Have a Dream" speech in Washington, D.C. We will never perhaps forget that bombing incident, but the names need to be remembered again and mentioned. Addie Mae, Cynthia Wesley, Denise McNair, and Carol Robertson, 4 young ladies who died in the basement of the 16th Street Baptist Church. However, there was one more young lady in that basement bathroom who survived, seldom mentioned. A 5th girl, her name was Sarah Collins. And this is a part of the reality of healing. Sarah survived, and she kept asking herself, in great personal pain, why her friends had to die. I have a short video clip that I would like to show you about this remembrance of these young ladies. Now, some of the scenes that are going to be shown will indicate the violence that may be uncomfortable for some to view. So if you want to take a moment to turn away from that, you can, but it is a part of our history. I'm going to divide this clip into 2 parts. So the first part will be the introduction of these 4 ladies and the 5th lady who survived. And the second part of it, after I shift a little bit, will be a statement of the pain of that hadn't been healed because nobody paid attention to it at the time. It was put under wraps, so to speak. But she is bringing it up to view for us. So if you hold on just for a minute, I'm going to bring this up. If I can get to my share is not appearing for me, Karen. And I don't know why.
That's good. Let's see. Let me just check. You should be.
Okay, I've got it now.
Okay, good.
All right.
You got a bunch of old folks navigating this and it doesn't always work.
I know. Here we go.
Of struggle seemed to promise that change would indeed be coming. But any hope of the end to the violence would be crushed on a warm, rainy Sunday morning.
I remember how Janie and Adam and myself, how we walked to church, having so much fun.
Earlier that morning, bombers would quietly place a box of dynamite attached to a timer under the steps of the church.
Churches were being bombed throughout Birmingham. And the 16th Street Baptist Church was a well-known meeting place for blacks at that particular time.
She was so fun-loving. She loved how she played baseball, and that little time we had together, I just really loved her, and she loved to be around me because we were so close in age, and she loved to draw. She was so sweet. She wasn't afraid of anything.
Cynthia was what we might call today a soulmate. Cynthia was adopted, and what I remembered most about her, she was very petite, but she had a great sense of humor.
Denise, she was so quiet and sweet, and she would get along with everybody. Everybody just loved her. And Carol, we was all in the choir together, and we would stop by Carol Robertson's house to walk to choir rehearsal with us. They were just nice young ladies.
Something that's rarely mentioned is that there were actually 5 girls in the bathroom. The 5th girl was Sarah Collins. She was 12 years old, and Sarah survived the blast that took place in the women's bathroom here. I arrived at church.
I'm going to switch over to where we have Sarah Collins talking about the pain of remembrance. Just a second.
Came in, I asked her, what was Addie? And she said that Addie had hurt her back, but she was coming to see me tomorrow. And but later on, she was talking to somebody, and she told them that one of her sister was killed in the bombing. And I was upset because I didn't understand why they had to kill Addie. And then later on, after I come out, they rushed me to surgery and they operated on my eye. And I found out that the other three girls, Denise, Carol, and Cynthia, they was killed also. And I was going through this thing in my mind all the time, crying at night, wondering why were these girls killed. I just didn't understand.
It was something that we never talked about. No one ever even said, well, are you afraid? Are you okay?
One thing about it, when I went back to school, they didn't counsel me. They didn't give me any counsel. And I went back to school in a terrible condition.
That was
So this is the terrible situation that Sarah faced, remembering and asking the question, why did those girls have to die? Karen, I'm having a little trouble getting my screen back to where I want it.
We've got you.
Okay, I'm coming around. All right. So just for a moment, we remember the long road of hurt and the need for healing that Sarah felt and those haunting words. Why did these girls have to die? The trouble is we're still asking that question today of different people in our time, aren't we? Think of the names: George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and just recently, Jonathan Price can be added to that list. And our world is shaken from rampant racism and also the terror of the novel coronavirus. We've all been looking for a miracle, perhaps. For the coronavirus, we're looking for a vaccine drug to come quickly. Or maybe we want a wand to wave to cure our madness of inhumane treatment of each other. Or a singular charismatic person to walk into the room and change everything and everybody instantly. A Messiah type of person. But the real question is, what does it mean for you and for me to be part of healing and to be a responsible, caring human being as an agent of healing? This is an interfaith sponsored event, so we do carry a belief amongst us that our faith resources will impact the healing of our world. And today we'll be exploring the concept of healing that embraces, and this is a strange thing, healing that embraces disruption and disorder as a positive force that moves us toward healing. That sounds counterintuitive, doesn't it? We're going to explore that for a moment and hopefully challenge you. We have three distinguished guests who have been discussing this process of healing. And while we were discussing and preparing, we put together a diagram to aid us in thinking about this work of healing. We call it the cycle of healing, and it's a U diagram. We'll be discussing what that means in a minute. First, I want to tell you about our special guest panelists. different perspectives they bring to the table today. First, Dr. James Garbarino, and then Reverend Jim Melson, and Reverend Walter Johnson. Jim Garbarino brings a perspective on children as a developmental psychologist who has studied and written extensively on the experiences of violence that children and youth have endured in many forms, in many places around the world. He's written numerous books. He is retired from Cornell University, where he was the co-director of the Family Life Development Center. After Columbine happened, he was invited out there by a family to study the situation and subsequently wrote 3 books on that matter. Reverend Dr. Jim Melson brings to us a career of working on racism and reconciliation through his work in the Cornelius Corps, a ministry of the New Community as part of the Church of the Savior in Washington, D.C. Jim is a retired United Methodist clergy of the Virginia Conference, and he has done work in many states up and down the Mid-Atlantic area. And Reverend Walter Johnson is the pastor of Zion Prospect Baptist Church in Yorktown, Virginia. He's retired from a military career, and besides numerous community works that he is engaged with to help serve the needs of the community, he's also a board member of the Peninsula Pastoral Counseling Center. Walter brings an awareness of the emotional, psychological, and spiritual struggles that impact the community. Now, before we go into a panel discussion, I want to show you this diagram that we put together. It's called the cycle of healing. There's a pattern that is emerging in our thinking here, and in this time of crisis may help us to see that healing is not magical. It is hard work for all of us. Let me show you this diagram, if I may. This is the cycle of healing. I have a quote in the middle of it from one of my favorite authors and meditations that I read frequently. He said, "If we do not transform our pain, we will always transmit it. If we do not transform our pain, we will always transmit it." As we are talking about healing, the first thing to look at is on the left side where it says order, status quo. Well, we could say normalcy. Most people, and I'm included in that, sort of stay in this bubble of normalcy, of going about my life, doing what I'm comfortable in doing, carrying on the values and living them out as I am comfortable with them, but not always seeing other things that need to be seen, or changing myself when I need to be changed, perhaps, until we recognize that something happens and things that we've been wearing like clothes no longer fit very well. I have a friend who, he gave me an example of this from his wife. His wife threw away a pair of old blue jeans he'd been wearing forever. He loved them and he wore them all the time, but they got holes in them and they were torn, and she finally felt like, well, you know, they're good for the garbage now. And she threw them in the trash. My friend, you know what he did? He went to the trash and pulled them out and he put them back on. I think sometimes we can't get rid of the things that we no longer need to wear. They're worn out, they're gone. But it's our status quo, our order, our normalcy. Now in this year, wow, our order has been shaken. Our foundations have been shaken. This order feels like it's almost normal at times. We have everything happening in the areas of the environment, and even now with a hurricane coming again towards the Gulf Coast area, fires in the West, and floods and tornadoes. We're besieged by the environmental issues that shake us, but we're also shaken by the social climate right now that is highly polarized and hurtful, and the racism rampant that we've been talking about. It's come up to a view that we cannot turn our eyes away from. I couldn't turn my eyes away from watching a man die in a period of 8 minutes and 46 seconds. It brings us to a place that there is confusion and chaos. We see it in the streets, we see it on the internet, we see it in communications, we see it in the fear that we feel within ourselves about talking about it within our families maybe. So if we're at that point, perhaps, we look towards healing as a new order, a new place, the ideal of the beloved community, perhaps. And to get from chaos, which, you know, sometimes it takes something really earth-shattering to shake us and to cut loose from old habits. Now we talk about transformation. What in the world does that mean? Well, now's when I want to turn to my panel, and we want to talk to them. We've got a couple of questions to present to them, and I'm going to get back to my screen, hopefully here in a second, in the stop share, and get back to, all right, I need to see my panelists. I know Dr. Melson, you're there. If you would unmute and turn on your video. I know that Walter's trying to get in. I hope he's in.
I'm in.
Ah, great. Wonderful. Are you able to come on video?
No.
No, you're going to be by phone.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. And Jim Melson, are you there?
I am.
Okay, maybe you could come on by video.
Yep, I have mine turned on.
There you go. Thank you. And Jim Garbarino, are you coming in? He might have. I tried to reach him earlier because we were a little ahead of time. So Jim is in Guatemala. So we may have to may have to bypass him at this moment. So we'll go ahead with our questions that we had before. So let me pose the question to you. Let's see if I can find it here now. As we looked at this diagram, Walter, you're a local pastor, and
okay.
You've been there for 30 years, and you had military career behind you. You've been doing a lot of things in the community, and you're on the Peninsula Pastoral Counseling Center Board of Directors. What has been the disruption to your community, to the lives of people? What's been shaking the core of their being, their feeling, their view of life? What's happening to them?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, I know we have the pandemic going now. I don't know that is a disruption. I think what it is, it helps us to, what happens as a result of the killing out in Wisconsin, it brings back those very same things that we've been dealing with all our lives. And it's just become more apparent. And sometimes it looks like it's the same thing, it's just coming in a different form. I'm old enough and been around long enough that I went through I remember the many things that we have experienced. I remember the voter rights. I remember the Jim Crow as a child experiencing those things. I remember, as I said, the voter rights. I remember in the 1980s when I was in the military, and almost every one of those had the same types of things happening in our lives. So I guess what I would say, Charles, from my thought process right now is we are still in the midst dealing with the same stuff. And I use stuff because it's stuff that we're using. We're still dealing with those same problems. And it still looks the same way. It doesn't look it maybe, but it is the same thing. So I guess from the Jim Crow, you looked at the water fountains and things like that. The voter rights, look at Dr. King and all of those working through those processes. And when I was in the military, I was in there when we had the race riots going on across the country. So if you go back and look at the same thing, you find the voter suppression in this election coming up already. You find the race riots already. And we still see signs of Jim Crow still in effect. So I'm not sure that it's attention. It's a way. I don't want to say it's a way of life, but it's there. And until we deal with the very beginning, the essence of the problem, when it started over 400 years ago, and really identify what brought on these type of things, I don't think we're going to change too much. So that's where I am with my thought process right now.
So some of the root things that have been there for a long while really haven't been, in your mind, dealt with, right? Or is this a perception that is different from the white community to the African American community, you think?
I kind of think so, because it's, when you're in it, you feel it, but when you're not in it, it's a part of life. People don't recognize it. I've watching some of the talk shows and listened to people, and oftentimes people say, well, I never knew it existed because you didn't see me. And so therefore you don't see what you don't see. And so therefore I think it's still there.
I'm going to turn to Jim Melson. Jim, you've done a lot of work for the past 20 years of your career with churches and communities. How are the church communities being impacted now in this dual crisis that we've got, or triple crisis, I guess, if we include the environment? But are communities of faith being shook up, and are they profoundly affected in any way?
Yeah, thank you, Charles, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this discussion. And I want to pick up with what Walter said, because I think there's a difference in the church communities depending on the racial background. I think, unfortunately, it's still a reality that in predominantly white spaces, we have a choice whether to be disrupted or not. And I think a lot of white spaces, including white churches, choose to maintain try to maintain the normalcy that you mentioned, so that we never get to the disruption, that never gets to the chaos, that doesn't get to the healing. And so one of the events that I experienced over the past couple months, after the murder of George Floyd and the many protests and civil unrest that happened as a result of that, you remember on June the 1st, that chaotic scene at Lafayette Square where the president cleared the peaceful protesters in order to make that photo op by holding a Bible. Well, right after that, they closed off Lafayette Square with 7-foot-high fencing, kind of a Berlin Wall approach. And but the protesters and those standing up for racial justice made that wall into a gallery. And I went down there one night, and there were signs and posters of all types promoting racial justice. But one that caught my attention was a simple cardboard sign in which there was a message to white people that simply said, "White people, do your work." And to me, what that meant was not just go out and do any old frantic thing, but to look deeply into our history. The bishop mentioned this morning that we do not have a common story. And for most of us who are white, depth of racism in the history of our country was not something that was part of our formal education. And so we need to seek that out. And the church can be a primary place because we're about, and any faith community of any tradition, we're about truth telling. And so what does it mean to actively seek out this truth? And there will come disruption with that because it disrupts the normal narrative that almost all of us that grew up in white spaces were taught. And so I think we can do the church, the faith community, the country a service if we are willing to enter the disruption. But we have to say that the reality is that choosing whether or not to enter the disruption is another example of white privilege. But I hope we will use our privilege in order to go to the depth where we can actually become partners and allies that are really working with the truth of our country.
I understand that Jim Garbarino is now with us. Jim, are you there? If you can unmute and put there you are, good. Jim's down in Guatemala. So Jim, we're glad to have you. I don't know if you heard the conversations that went on with Walter and with Jim Melson, but you have a phenomenal view of the world from all parts of it. And you've been doing a lot of work with children and violence and youth and violence. What do you see now that's impacting our children and youth in this time of crisis? Are they being deeply impacted and affected? Is it being different for different groups of people? What do you see happening?
Well, my first thought thinking about all of this was something I learned many years ago, and that is that traumatic memories do not spontaneously decay. That traumatic memories have an endurance. At the individual level, this is very clear. I'll give you an example. My mother was a young person in London during the bombing of London during World War II. And both, I think, because of who she was as a person and being English, very stiff upper lip, you would have thought that, this didn't have much of an impact on her at all. She always talked about the war as being sort of a glorious time in her young life. But she did have a number of traumatic experiences, witnessing buildings blowing up and, fear and all of that sort of thing. And it may, decades later, you'd think, that would have passed away, but it didn't. I remember the night of the first bombing of Baghdad during the Gulf War when CNN was carrying the bombing live. That bombing evoked and rekindled those traumatic memories that had taken place almost half a century earlier, and they were as vivid then as they had been at the time. I think of that because one of the themes in all of our consciousness raising about racism is that we have never really processed the traumatic memories of slavery and extinction of indigenous people. It's certainly true within those communities. With indigenous people in the first generation of contact with Europeans, it's now thought that something like 90% of all the indigenous people in North and South America died. And you think of the magnitude of that collective trauma which passed on, clearly culturally passed on, but as you know, there is some evidence it can be passed on genetically as well. There's a study of Holocaust survivors that indicates genetic transmission of trauma across generations. And among African Americans with the trauma of slavery, that clearly has resonated across generations, in part because we've never come to terms with racism and it's never really been healed. So on the white side of the equation, you know, there is the vicarious trauma, there is the moral trauma of being involved in these things that resonates. And once again, traumatic memories do not spontaneously decay. They have to be processed to decay. And I think that's true of both individual and collective traumas. That was my original thought.
Thank you, Jim. I don't know if either one of you want to react to what Jim said before we move on to the second part of this healing cycle, but just pause for a moment to see if either Jim or Walter have a comment that they want to make at this point.
Not for me, no.
Okay.
And Charles, I would just add, and thank you, Jim, for what you said, and pointing out that the trauma is carried by both sides, that the trauma of oppression of the oppressors is real too and needs to be dealt with. So, and of course, we haven't come close to that.
Let me pull this diagram back up again for us just before we move on. I guess the questions are, in my mind, as I hear you talking about this again, is whether or not the order, the normalcy of people's lives have been shaken enough. Has there been enough disorder and enough questioning that would lead to another stage, which we'd call transformation? I remember you saying, Walter, in one of our discussions in preparation, but you weren't sure that we were ready for transformation. That seems to be a real question here. Are we ready for transformation?
Again, I still stay with that because I think to get to transformation, you have to get through the problems of identifying and accepting where we are and accepting what we need to do to begin the healing process. And the healing process, before you can be transformed, you got to know, I believe, begin to work on what causes the need for transformation. And what calls for the need for transformation is the type of racism that we experience as African Americans in this country.
Yeah, I'm wondering if some parts of our society is asking the question, well, we can write it out. Why do we need to change? We
can't write it out.
Yeah, we want to go back to what's normal.
It's not normal, yeah. Yeah, you're right. Yes, yeah.
So Jim Garbarino, you talked about processing memories and dealing with the past. How do you see that as something that we can do, or how we would do it as we would move toward a new status quo, a new order? We have lifted up the beloved community as something that we want to build. And the building blocks for that are pretty tough, it seems to me.
Yeah, I think so. And to piggyback on what was said before, there was a poll in 2019 in which 75% of Republicans said that the big problem was racism directed at white people. And, a bare majority of independents felt the same way. Only even 20-something% of Democrats thought that racism against white people was a big issue. That seems to me a major impediment because, from a psychological point of view, there's a lot of research on what's called confirmatory bias. Confirmatory bias is how people are able and willing and motivated to discount empirical evidence that contradicts their existing belief. That one of the most sort of interesting examples is before the first astronauts went to the moon, there was a whole field of study of lunar geology, and they had reached certain conclusions about the moon and its geology. When the first moon rocks were brought back, the initial analysis tended to disprove some of those thoughts and beliefs about the geology of the moon. And somebody had done a study where they interviewed lunar geologists, and they found the dominant response was, quote, "There's something wrong with the rocks." That the evidence went against what they knew to be true, and so they discounted the evidence. That's a very powerful phenomenon, and there have been empirical studies of that. And I think that's some of what's going on, that people selectively are attuned to evidence that confirms their initial bias that the problem is racism against white people. And then when you have an institution like Fox News that is constantly offering up to those individuals information to bolster that position, it's no wonder that we're sort of stuck there. And I agree that the transformation can't really come until we are able to pierce that veil of misperception. But it's a very difficult process intellectually as well as emotionally.
Jim Melson, how do churches that you have worked with grasp this problem and are seeking a pathway to transformation?
Yeah, thank you. I do think we've talked before about the faith communities being a resource in the network of community organizations and support. And you know, I've had experience in working with faith communities that do want to face the truth and the realities and enter the disruption. Now, that doesn't mean it's comfortable, but it is consistent with our faith tradition's way of healing as well. So, for example, one of the things we've done in predominantly white spaces is to look at both the history of the country and the history of the church in terms of the reality not only of the existence of systemic racism, but the church's complicity in that, in order then to find a way forward. And I recently came across a quote that was helpful to me, because I think, especially in white churches, there's a tendency, once people begin to open their eyes, to say, okay, well, what are we going to do? And this particular author, a white pastor from Chicago, said that maybe the foundational question should not be what are we going to do, but how well will we continue to see? And if we continue to deepen our seeing, then the steps that we take are likely to be more constructive steps. So it's not a one and done. It's not I get educated, then I go fix things. It's I'm on this journey of deepening awareness, deepening spiritual formation, and then discerning steps to be in partnership with people, especially with people who have experienced the full force of racism, to be in partnership to discern steps towards greater levels of racial justice.
I was thinking of my friend again with his old blue jeans that his wife threw in the trash. He really liked those blue jeans, and maybe in a sense we really deep down like our life the way it is, and you know, we can ride out the disruption, we can make cosmetic changes, and maybe things will look okay. What do you think?
I think that's a very significant significant part of this, that the inertia, the ability to compartmentalize both in your mind and in your daily life is a real impediment to the kind of change we're talking about. And I think this quote that you gave, excuse me, how well we will continue to see, you know, since we're using quotes today, the German poet Goethe wrote, what is most difficult, that which you think is easiest to see what is before your eyes. And I think that that's part of it, that in some ways, you know, it ought to be right there, obvious in our faces, but it's obscured by the ways that I think belief systems and day-to-day social experience shield us. one last quote. You can't diagnose something if you don't believe it exists. And I think that's why that connection with the poll on a lot of people thinking the problem is racism directed against white people. You can't diagnose racism in its authentic form if that's your view, and you have to be able to move beyond that. So I think a lot of people aren't ready to operate in this realm because they don't believe it exists. They believe the opposite is true, and they get institutional support for that. It's a huge impediment.
Jim Melson, in the book Color of Purple, which you've been leading studies on, Jamar Tisby reminds us of that theological principle of our core being created equal in the image of God. It seems to me that is not where people are in this process, and allows them some kind of compartmentalizing capability, I guess, as Jim says. What do you think?
Yeah, and that book, The Color of Compromise, is a very helpful resource. And I think it's not only a matter of what we never knew, that right now, as Jim Garbarino said, that there are forces at the highest levels that are actively denying the reality. Some of you may have seen on the news that on September the 22nd, not too long ago, the president issued an executive order that would require all diversity training within the federal government, first of all, to stop, and second of all, then to submit their material in order to be reviewed. Now, the executive order has a nice name to it. It's called the Executive Order on Combating Race and Sex Stereotyping. And when you first hear that, you think that would be great. But if you actually, and you can find it online, what it actually does is say, don't be self-critical at all about the history of our country, because after all, everything's equal now. And I want to just share a few phrases from that where they identify what to be on the lookout for that would indicate material that they want to do away with. And listen to this, and it sounds like we would not qualify who are here today. It says the Office of Management and Budget instructs that agencies identify all diversity and inclusion training held during fiscal 2020 and their costs, and that they're encouraging agencies to conduct a review of those training programs, suggesting a keyword search for terms such as critical race theory, white privilege, intersectionality, systemic racism, positionality, racial humility, and unconscious bias. And those are all catchwords in order to eliminate any programs that would dare to go in that direction. So I think, again, we're not just talking about what we don't know. We're talking about having to actively challenge this direction to go backwards instead of even being willing to go forward.
Wow.
That's powerful. Walter, you see, we see together that people are marching, demonstrating, a lot of upsetness. But what is it that's going to take in the community to move us together to make a significant change, not just cosmetic? Do you have any thoughts about that?
I do, Charles, but I don't know if I can say it. I think what we really need to do is, first of all, doing what we're doing right now. I think this is one of the first things is started having more conversations, as my brother said, from the churches and all of the different civic groups, that we begin to not only talk about it, but become reality. I think one of the places we can start really was within our schools. We won't talk much about our schools, but I think that you need to help our children to understand the real story or a better story than what we have today. Much of what we are talking about now, particularly as to deal with an African American, has not been written. So therefore, that whole segment of it seems to be the stick in the mud is not even being talked about at that level. It might be talked about, but it's not being pushed enough. I shared with you all some time ago when I was in the military, and I was in there during those times that we had those racial problems. And one of the things we did do is we had what we call sensitive training, racial training, and it helped a lot. But that meant that you had to sit down and begin to deal with those things that we don't talk about. And I think that's the issue, is we've got to begin to deal with that so that not only just to say that we've done it, but that it becomes a part of one's life. And we have to begin to hold people accountable for the things that they do, and it's going to be difficult.
You made an allusion to something just obliquely there about schools that drew me to the memory of history that has been covered up or not reported. There's a lot of you were telling me about some things that you didn't even know that had happened, and
exactly.
We seem to have a lot of history that has been not told or been revised or in some ways made to look better than they really are, and
some were flat out lies. It didn't happen the way they say it happened.
Right.
Yeah.
So a big part of the next stage has to do with getting history right, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. And it has to be, I think, with all people engaged in it, from all walks of life. Everyone needs to have a say at the table.
Either Jim's have any comment on that part?
Well, I agree that in one way, the starting point is history, because in some ways it's easier for people to see the playing out of these forces historically, where they don't have to accept quite the same personal responsibility if they can understand it in a historical phenomenon. I remember one of my earliest professional experiences, I must have been 21, 22 years old, was in the junior high school being asked to co-teach a course on Black history and Black studies. There was an African-American teacher and I, and we we met with our same race groups 2 days a week and the integrated group 3 days a week. But this was a group of motivated 14-year-olds who generally are ignorant, but their ignorance about the racial history of the country was dramatic. And that's true, on every level going up. I've taught college students for decades. So I do think that's a good place to start, is clarifying and illuminating the history, because as some of the people who are writing comments are saying that, there's, and as I think the thing the other Jim was talking about the suppression of programming dealing with racism, that there is a clear political dimension to this that is driven by, to some degree, ideological things, but also self-interest. And to expose that in the past may be one way to start letting people have more of an opportunity to see it in the present, because clearly this issue is being politically utilized in some very destructive ways. And maybe historical analysis is a way to prepare people better to get to the point where they can accept the need for chaos and therefore the need for transformation. That was my thought about it.
Well, I want to thank all three of you. I think I've used as much time, and we had a little extra time to work with, and I'm glad that we could all come together from different places to this point. And so, you know, thank you very much for what you've contributed today. And I'm going to wind this up now, and we'll be moving on to the next section. But let me give just a concluding statement here. Healing, again, I think we tried to make this point all along, is not magical. It can't be cosmetic. It's very hard work of being responsible human beings in a complex world. There are many dimensions that go into healing, and it's going to take a long time. We've had some disturbing times, but have they been disturbing enough so that we can utilize all of our spiritual, moral, and interconnecting community resources for the benefit of the dignity and well-being of all God's children? Are we, and I'm going to go back to Walter, are we really ready for any sense of deep transformation, or is our society going to wait it out until after the election or after the vaccine or to after something or another, and we might get back to what everybody wants as normalcy? Or are we going to be able to shake off some things and go to a new normal, our new order? And that's a new vision. So beyond the healing, I'm going to turn to my next colleague. We'll be looking to hope, and hope builds on healing, and healing needs also to have a vision of building the beloved community inscribed in hope. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
And thank all of you. The lawn guys are outside of my window right now, so I can't do much about that. I'm hoping that they don't start trimming the bushes immediately within my line of sight, but we'll see about that. This all sounds like a lot of work, and I think we may be feeling a little overwhelmed. But before we move on, I want to mention that I'm struck by the comments that are popping up in the chat box. There's a lot of thinking going on, and I really commend to you the comments in that box. That's great. Charles has provided us with a way forward, and let's see, just a second. Charles has, I've got some noise coming from somebody. Oh, dear. Anyway, Charles has provided us with a way forward and given us a lead in to our next presenter, another member of our team, Phil Kuehnert, who's a retired Lutheran pastor, who's going to lead a discussion now about the all-important concept of hope, which helps us avoid the despair that often accompanies difficult challenges. And I'm going to mute myself so you don't hear my lawn guys, and I'm going to turn this over to Phil.
Share my screen. Can you hear it?
See it here.
It is ironic that in the darkest of times, when the original sin of our nation seemed to have all of its people in its death grip, that slaves running for their lives would look into the night sky and see the drinking gourd. In the Big Dipper, they saw a drinking gourd that they had slaked their thirst many, many times in the fields. But in the drinking gourd, pointing north, they saw a road to freedom. I'm your host for the next 40 minutes, It has been an honor to work with the other members of our planning team for the past 4 months in planning this symposium. In this final segment, we experience the following. First, after a brief review of where we have been today, I will be asking you to think about symbols of hope, your personal symbol of hope, and a word that you associate with hope, and I'll be inviting you to share that. Then I will present for your quiet meditation an array of hope quotes. Quotes from the 3 Abrahamic traditions, as well as quotes from philosophical, political, and religious figures. I've invited 2 philosophers who have thought long, hard, and deep about the beloved community, its origins, and the hope of the beloved community, and the hope that our individual beloved communities provide us. We will close this final H with John Lewis's posthumous valedictory, which was published shortly after his death, as read by Morgan Freeman and as presented by MSNBC News. It's been a long journey today. We started with honor, with heroes, health, and most recently, healing. We began by honoring the victims of racial violence, victims of the COVID-19, of gun, economic, environmental violence, grateful for their courage and their sacrifices. And we, of necessity, named them and showed you their pictures. We have acknowledged and declared our determination to support our heroes, many of whom work under the cloak of invisibility, tragically ghosted, who often mindlessly sacrifice themselves with little recognition, but knowing at some level they are serving the common good. We celebrated a holistic concept of health that includes faith-based initiatives of equality, justice, and mercy. We were sobered by the overwhelming factors that fight against health. We acknowledge that healing is extraordinarily subjective. We affirm that healing takes place in beloved communities, including communities of faith and the institutions that have been created by the imperatives of faith, like our own Virginia Interfaith Center for Public Policy. Those beloved communities and institutions are necessary to break the hopelessness and despair of isolation and illness. And it is in those communities and institutions that the history and the stories are held sacred and are shared with boldness and honesty. And now the final H. Hope demands that we look to our shared faith. It is undeniable that the faith of Martin Luther King Jr., John Lewis, and other civil rights saints, as earlier was mentioned about Charles Marsh's book that underscores that point, their faith led them to lead. Their faith led them to commit themselves to a philosophy of nonviolence in the extraordinary belief that unmerited suffering is redemptive. The 3 Abrahamic traditions are all unapologetically theocentric. All 3 faith traditions eschew reliance on human ability at the expense of Yahweh, Allah, the Trinity. It has been times of crisis, times of change, times of uncertainty, that people have been driven to seek hope outside of their own resources. The Tanakh, the Quran, the New Testament contain the stories of how God has been faithful to his people in times of crisis and in times of traumatic change. Those stories explain why God, or God's word, or God's representatives deserve honor, deserve a hearing, and deserve obedience. And embedded in those stories are beloved communities. And in the beloved communities are embedded those stories. Today, those same beloved communities gather in synagogues, in churches, in mosques, in living rooms. They gather at school or the university. They gather in the living room. Beloved communities are where people of faith gather to renew their hope. It is certainly myopic, if not inexcusable, for people of faith to ignore the importance for faith as we seek to address a wounded world. Now, this is your opportunity to participate through the chat box. I hope all of you have found the chat box. Some of you are using it wonderfully. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So, when you hear the word hope, where do your thoughts take you? What is your primary symbol, image, object of hope? Or maybe this, what is the one word that would capture your hope? I ask you now to share that object, that image, that symbol or word in the chat box. And while you work on that, let me share with you a series of hope quotes. And at the end of that, we'll share some of your symbol or words with the participants. Hope is the thing with feathers and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. Noam Chomsky. There's many reasons to hope. So yes, there's hope, but not if people give up. Senator Cory Booker. Hope right now in America is bloodied and battered. But this is the kind of hope that is successful. It's hope that has lost its naivete, a calloused hope. The Quran. So, do not lose hope, nor be sad. You will surely be victorious if you are true in faith. John Lewis. Do not get lost in a sea of despair. Be hopeful. Be optimistic. Our struggle is not the struggle of a day, a week, a month, or a year. It is a struggle of a lifetime. Never, ever be afraid to make some noise and get in good trouble, necessary trouble. From the Old Testament. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. Austin Channing Brown. And so hope for me has died 1,000 deaths. Finally, I'd hoped that friend would get it, but hope died. I hoped that a person would be an ally for life, but hope died. I hoped that my organization really desired change, but hope died. I hoped that history would stop repeating itself, but hope died. From St. Paul's letter to the Romans, we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope. And hope does not put us to shame, because God's love has been poured into our hearts. Nicholas Kristof. Hope is the engine oil of campaigns, but it burns up in the heat of governing. St. Augustine. Hope has two beautiful daughters. Their names are anger and courage. Anger at the way things are, and courage to see that they do not remain as they are. Paul Ricoeur or St. Teresa? Hope is the same as remembering. And now let's see what we have from the chat box. Monitoring the chat box has been my wife of several years. And this is what we found. Words, objects, hope. Young people. Another said the cross. Someone shared that their image is a rainbow-colored giraffe. Another shared renewal. Another shared diversity in unity. Someone shared that their hope is our children. Someone said their hope is in potential. Common cup in the sacrament. Wow. Someone shared their symbol of hope is the sunrise. Another person shared their hope is the faces of my grandchildren. Another person, and I want to thank them for this, said that their hope was participation in this symposium. And finally, one person said their hope is optimism. Thank you so much for sharing those. And now we're going to focus specifically on building the beloved community. Building the Beloved Community became the title of this symposium. And at this point, I want to introduce to you Dr. Jacob L. Goodson, professor at Southwestern College in Kansas, Winfield, Kansas, and Dr. Brad Elliott Stone, professor at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. They have both prepared self-introductions, but I'd like to thank them at this point for taking on this project. They took it upon themselves 7 weeks ago, and for 7 consecutive Fridays, they have met together for an hour to talk about their presentations. Amazingly, for the past 4 Fridays, they have allowed me to sit in on their conversations in which they develop their presentations today. They look forward to engaging you through questions or comments, again in the chat box. So as they present, if you have questions, please put those in the chat box. Judy is monitoring that, and we will share them at the end. So at this point, I am inviting Dr. Jacob Goodson to join us.
Yeah, I'm here. Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, Jacob.
Okay, great. So good to be here and to be with you, at least virtually.
Can you unmute yourself?
We can hear him, Phil.
Okay, great. So good to be here and to be with you virtually.
We still don't have you.
We can hear him, Phil. I think maybe you have concerns on your end.
Yeah, we can hear him fine, Phil. So,
There's Brad.
So shall we just go ahead?
I see Brad.
Yeah, Jacob's right there, and we could hear him when he was talking, so it's all good.
Reverend Kuehnert asked me to say a few autobiographical words, and I wanted to do that, but to do that in connection with
Can you hear him?
some of the broader themes that will be raised today. So
we can't hear. I'm sorry.
Phil, we can hear.
We can hear him.
There must be something wrong on your end, so I think we can let him go on and figure out what's going on.
So I was raised in a conservative evangelical Christian circles in Oklahoma, particularly as a Southern Baptist.
Go ahead.
In my teenage years, we attended a mega church of 2,000 members, where I was known mostly as Connie's son, because my mother was in charge of all the children ministries. So I was not Jacob, but I was Connie's son. With a church that size, I did not grow up thinking in terms of the importance of community. It was Sunday mornings were basically just mere survival. I moved to Chicago for my first graduate degree, and my community became defined by the scholarly life and being with other scholars. This was the first time I had a sense of belonging somewhere. I was among graduate students and professors. Notoriously, academics make for poor company. However, I finally felt that there were people out there that shared my interest in reading, researching, and writing. My first year of married life also took place in Chicago, but only for 1 year. Angela, my partner, and I moved from Chicago to Charlottesville so that I could pursue a PhD at the University of Virginia. We joined a small Baptist church in Charlottesville so that we can make friends with families with small children. That church did feel like a community to us. We became very close friends with the pastor and his spouse. We had both of our children while we lived in Charlottesville. Then the pastor left. They moved to Texas, and the church council decided to purge those members who were friends with the former pastor. I know that we experienced community in that congregation because we felt the pain so deeply of being asked to leave. At that point, my primary community became a few graduate students also working with the same doctoral advisor that was advising me. My wife felt like she was left without community, and we still have unhealed wounds from that time in our lives. We then moved from Charlottesville to Williamsburg because I had been offered a teaching position at the College of William and Mary. In my first semester teaching there, we plugged right into King of Glory Lutheran Church. King of Glory was unique in our married life because Angela experienced community there before I did. Because of our personalities, the reverse is usually the case for us. Eventually, I enjoyed some of the deepest friendships I've had in my adult life, particularly friendships with the Kuehnerts and the Partlows. Because of the community there, we still consider Williamsburg the place that feels most like home. However, I was on year-to-year contracts at William and Mary. Although we had genuine community in Williamsburg, Angela grew reasonably impatient about getting her career started. For her to do that, she needed my job to become more secure and stable. So I applied for 84 faculty positions in the fall of 2012. By April 2013, I had accepted a position as the lone philosophy professor at Southwestern College in Winfield, Kansas. For Angela's sake, we moved to Wichita instead of Winfield. Wichita is 45 minutes north of the college. After 2 years living in Wichita, however, we bought our first house together, but decided to buy in Winfield so that I could become the primary parent to our daughters. To fulfill that role, I needed to be close to work. Winfield is a town of 12,000 people, and the college averages about 600 students per year. I have never lived or taught at a place so small than I am now. Winfield comes with all the joys and the difficulties of small town life. Angela is now a full-time therapist. She surprisingly found a position as a therapist available in Winfield. So we're all four located now in Winfield full-time. There is a strong sense of community here, and we do our best to contribute to the community when and where we can. I've given you these reflections because the presence and absence of community shapes how I reflect on my life and what I remember about each place where I have lived. None of these communities, however, represent exactly what Josiah Royce meant by the phrase beloved community, which is what I turn to now. I turn to Royce's description of the beloved community, not because we have to agree with what he says about it, but rather the way that my brain works is that I like to clarify and understand the original development and usage of concepts or phrases. For the phrase beloved community, Royce is that person. So now Royce and the beloved community. Josiah Royce was an American philosopher who taught at Harvard University for most of his career. He was alive from 1855 through 1916. Part of his legacy is that he coined the phrase beloved community. And what I want to talk about today are the attributes or characteristics of such a community according to Royce. After I offer that explanation, I turn to Martin Luther King's use of the same phrase. In one of his first uses of the phrase beloved community, Royce claims that each of us has an obligation to act as if we are bringing about such a community. Royce claims that each of us has an obligation to act as if we are bringing about such a community. Royce writes, quote, "Every proposed reform, every moral deed is to be tested by whether and to what extent it contributes to the realization of the beloved community. When one cannot find the beloved community, she needs to take steps to create it. And if there is not evidence of the existence of such a community, then the rule to live by is to act as to hasten its coming," end quote. For Royce, we must always act in such a way as if our actions and decisions help bring about the beloved community. We should not make an exception to this rule for ourselves. What is it that we are bringing about if we follow this rule? What are the attributes or characteristics of the beloved community? In my research on Royce, I find 5 features of the beloved community. First, the beloved community embodies universal love. Second, the beloved community serves as an ideal to constantly strive toward. Third, the beloved community offers a modern version of the medieval idea of the kingdom of God. Fourth, the beloved community requires all people to live by faith, grace, and love. And fifth, the beloved community represents the greatest hope possible for humanity. Royce talks about the beloved community as a universal in the sense that it ought to include all human beings and not limit itself to a particular religious community or a community of only like-minded people. As an ideal, it creates a standard for how we treat one another in our everyday lives. Are we treating others as if we are in the beloved community now? Royce's other word for faith is loyalty. By loyalty, Royce means finding meaning beyond ourselves, looking to live for something greater than our own egos and our own self-interest. In addition to being an ideal to strive toward, Royce thinks that an actual beloved community will come about one day. This actual beloved community serves as the greatest hope we can have in terms of what humanity can be and can become. An argument that I find quite powerful in Royce concerns his use of the past and future for thinking about how the beloved community might come to be. According to Royce, the beloved community is one in which has a truthful memory of the past and a hopeful expectation of the future. The beloved community is a community of truthful memory in the sense that it is, in the words of Royce, quote, a community constituted by the fact that each of its members accepts as part of his own individual life the same past events that each of his fellow members accepts, and we may call this a community of memory, end quote. To be a community of memory means avoiding using history to justify our own self-interest, being truthful about history even when doing so makes us feel uncomfortable about ourselves or our family, and identifying the wounds of the past. The beloved community is a community of hopeful expectation in the sense that it is, in the words of Royce, quote, a community constituted by the fact that each of its members accepts, as part of his own individual life, the same expected future events that each of his fellows accepts, and we may call this either a community of expectation or a community of hope, end quote. To be a community of hope, then, means being oriented toward the future, more specifically toward actualizing the beloved community, being truthful about the past because beloved community cannot be achieved if there is a refusal concerning truthfulness about the past, and thinking of beloved community as the achievement and embodiment of faith, hope, and love. Royce's understanding of faith, hope, and love involves loyalty to something greater than oneself, hope towards the future, and aiming for universal love. Now let's move on to Martin Luther King and his use of beloved community. During his doctoral program at Boston University, we know that Martin Luther King read almost all of Royce's writings. Royce was a great influence on the professors at Boston University at the time that King was a student there. Fast forward to 1956, King visited India in order to learn from and spend time with Gandhi. After he returns from his trip, King begins using Royce's phrase, beloved community, to describe his reasons for remaining nonviolent as the best way to address the sins of racism and white supremacy. King was trained as an American philosopher. He told his closest friends that he wanted to be remembered as a Baptist preacher. Yet most of us know him best as a civil rights leader. In the role of Baptist preacher in April 1957, King utilizes the phrase beloved community in his sermon entitled Birth of a New Nation. Here's a passage from that sermon. Quote, the aftermath of nonviolence is the creation of beloved community. The aftermath of nonviolence is redemption. The aftermath of nonviolence is reconciliation. The aftermath of violence are emptiness and bitterness. This is the thing that I'm concerned about. Let us fight passionately and unrelentingly for the goals of justice and peace, but let's be sure that our hands are clean in this struggle. Let us never fight with falsehood and violence and hate and malice, but always fight with love, so that when the day comes that the walls of segregation have completely crumbled in Montgomery, that we will be able to live with people as their brothers and sisters. End quote. King offers his own characteristics of beloved community in this passage. The beloved community is one that involves justice, peace, reconciliation, redemption, truth, and turning enemies into brothers and sisters. This notion of turning enemies into brothers and sisters reflects a point that drove King throughout his career. King worried about white resentment, and he sought through nonviolence to avoid white resentment. While I admire King's conviction on this point, if we have learned anything since 2016, no matter how loving, nonviolent, peaceful, and truthful Black Lives Matter protesters behave, white resentment seems unavoidable. I agree with King that the beloved community turns enemies into brothers and sisters, but we can no longer assume that the behavior of anti-racists will determine one way or another the resentment of racists and white supremacists. Later in 1957, in a writing called The Role of the Church in Facing the Nation's Chief Moral Dilemma, King uses the phrase beloved community again. Quote, but the end is reconciliation. The end is redemption. The end is the creation of the beloved community. It is this type of spirit and this type of love that can transform opposers into friends. The type of love that I stress here is not eros, a sort of aesthetic or romantic love. It's not philia, a sort of reciprocal love between friends, but it is agape, which is understanding goodwill for all human beings. It is an overflowing love which seeks nothing in return. It is the love of God working in the lives of all humans. This is the love that may well be the salvation of our civilization. End quote. We often hear the claim that the ends justify the means. In this case, that would mean that the achievement of beloved community would justify getting there any way that we could. King adamantly disagrees with this approach. For King, not only is it wrong to say that the ends justify the means, but using certain means necessarily prevents ever arriving at beloved community. For King, any approach either based on hate or that uses violence will block the achievement of beloved community. To achieve the end of beloved community requires means. To achieve the end of beloved community requires the means to involve agape love, nonviolence, and truthfulness. According to King, beloved community represents the salvation of civilization. In conclusion, reflections on hope and beloved community. So I have written a lot on hope, but much less on community. Part of the reason for this is that communities tend to be difficult and messy. I often hear philosophers and theologians assert that we should begin with community, or the community is what gives meaning to individual experience. While I certainly do not disagree with these claims, I often find that those defending the priority of community do not give us realistic pictures of how communities function and what communities look like. So I write less on community because I do not want to be accused of falling into the same trap that I see others falling into. What I find compelling about Royce's and King's notions of beloved community, however, is that they both think through the messiness of community. King recognizes that cultivating a community with both Black and white people together comes with its wounds. Royce turns the beloved community into a universal, which sounds like it might not take seriously the messiness, but he does so in order to treat community as an ideal that helps us manage and negotiate the communities of which we participate in our everyday lives. The way that the ideal helps us is that it offers a rule in our everyday lives. Always act in such a way as if our actions and decisions help bring about the beloved community. Such a rule does not ignore the messiness of living in community, but in fact helps us get through the messiness by maintaining our integrity in the relationships most challenging to us. If I were to write on community, and Reverend Kuehnert has got me thinking about what I would say, I think I would take the following approach. We must take into account the ways that communities involve broken promises yet trust, conflict and disappointment, forgiveness and recognition. Communities give us both surprising friendships and failed relationships. Communities constantly exclude and include without much reason given for either exclusion or inclusion. And one of the ways to contribute to community concerns calling out the exclusion of those who have less power and no voice within a community. Calling out those with social capital, however, means accepting that conflict and tension will arise and will continue within community. Thinking of communities in terms of how they allow for both contradictions and ideals, broken promises, conflict, disappointment, but also forgiveness, recognition, and trust becomes one way to say that we maintain hope in and strive toward the beloved community. Thank you so much.
Brad?
Good morning, everyone. At least on the West Coast, it's still morning. How great it is to be part of this marvelous discussion today. At the beginning of Psalm 133, we are reminded, oh, how good and pleasant it is when brothers and sisters live together in unity. That is our goal as we think today about beloved communities. I was born in rural Kentucky, Everyone knew everybody for generations, and blacks and whites both had land to farm. My grandfather's farm was over 100 acres, and he bought it with his own money. Everyone worked on everyone else's farm as well. Tobacco was our cash crop, and all the fields needed to be planted in the spring. Everyone worked everyone's fields to get the tobacco planted. Everyone ate lunch together. When crisis or illness struck one of the farmers, the other farmers made sure that the work still got done on all of the farms. I do not want to over-romanticize this scenario. It was the American South, and the differences between black people and whites were clear. Different churches, no intermarrying, etc. Yet, with work to be done, everyone worked together. Everyone was poor. There was only one neighborhood school by the time I went to school. Everyone had to live together. There was no such thing as a black neighborhood because there were not enough people really to support such a thing. I left my hometown to go to college. I studied at Georgetown College, one of Kentucky's great Baptist colleges. With only about 600 students, community was essential. We ate together. We went to chapel together. I knew my professors and my professors knew me. They encouraged me to pursue my doctorate degree. I won a Fulbright to the University of Salamanca, Spain, and I created community there as a cultural ambassador and scholar in residence. Upon returning to the United States, I started my doctoral studies at the University of Memphis, my first big city. Here, community was defined mostly in terms of my philosophy department. But in addition, I got involved in a church, First Congregational Church, which was not only racially diverse, but one of the few open and affirming churches in Memphis. At the church, everyone was included, and we shared our lives together as social outcasts. Liberal Memphis whites, black people, drag queens, gay couples, even homeless people. Everyone was a member of our community. One of my favorite moments was having communion. We would distribute the elements ourselves to our fellow congregants. Some Sundays, I was giving the bread and wine to a homeless person. Other times, to a drag queen named Morgana. The church was originally called Strangers Church, promising community to anyone who found themselves outside of the traditional groupings of Southern society. After getting my doctorate, I moved to Los Angeles to begin teaching at Loyola Marymount University. Community is hard to forge in such a large city, and particularly with such a modular one. People are at home, they then get in their cars, they then stay in their cars for quite some time, they then wind up at work, then after work, they get in their car for a very long time to get back home. Traffic is a real factor in getting together to have intentional community. As a result, I attend two churches in Los Angeles, one congregational and the other Episcopal, in order to have community. In such a big city, compared to the way I grew up, community is hard to forge. I've known Jacob for almost 20 years. A couple of years ago, I was on sabbatical, and Jacob invited me to Winfield, Kansas to give the annual Smith-Wilson lectures. I stayed for a whole month in order to write and enjoy a change of pace from the hectic California life. I became enchanted with the town and its people. I attended Grace Episcopal Church, played board games on Tuesday nights at Main Street Games, as well as joining a game group on campus. I set up meetings with other folk at Southwestern so as to engage the Black community, which was surprisingly quite large on that campus in the middle of Kansas. Winfield, in a certain way, reminded me of the communities from which I came, a town where people know each other and are known by others. I have decided that Winfield is one of my communities, although I live thousands of miles away. And this is how Jacob and I continue to have conversations that span thousands of miles. That's my autobiography piece. I want to talk today about avoiding idealism with the beloved community. There are three important things to keep in mind here so as not to fall into the trap of sentimental idealism when we talk about the beloved community. First, we must stay vigilantly aware that the beloved community cannot come about by political means alone. The inverse must be true. Once the beloved community is established, we will have a clear political agenda. One cannot vote the beloved community into existence. Second, we must avoid the temptation to reduce the beloved community to some set of economic programs as if poverty is the barrier to access to the beloved community. Instead, once the beloved community is established, everyone will be acutely aware of the needs of others, thus spurring new models of economics. Finally, one must not assume that everyone must be in the beloved community. That there are some who would rather quarrel or be divisive should not keep the beloved community from forming. If there is a beloved community, and one would rather not be a part of it, there are to be allowances, what Kwame Appiah calls right to exit. Thus, the beloved community is not a compromise between factions, nor is it a reconciliation of different political stances. It is a commitment to care about others and do concrete actions for each other for the sake of being a community. Let us explore briefly, by sake of contrast, what the beloved community cannot be. The beloved community cannot be a global phenomenon. It is inherently local. One of the problems currently facing us is the drive to make everything global. Although this goal sounds noble, it is often the result of neoliberal capitalism, which turns the world into one homogeneous place such that particular goods and services would have a worldwide appeal, audience, and set of consumers. Let us call this drive, following Jacques Derrida, mondialization. The idea of a global unity, often at the expense of local unities that make the world heterogeneous, demands a kind of conformity that could only be enforced with political authoritarianism and economic sanctions, neither of which has room for the real engines of the beloved community, love and community. When we realize that the world can be composed of a plurality of beloved communities, even ones quite different than the ones in which we participate, the global concerns begin to melt somewhat. Every beloved community is local, connected to the individuals who live in them. Although I can claim that I seek beloved community with people I do not know, I could never actually realize such a community. As I love to say to students all the time, there's only one way to know people. You have to know them, and they have to know you. The beloved community cannot be a national phenomenon. Nationalism and its affiliated concept of patriotism hinders the beloved community because, once again, it relies on a kind of conformity that is never present. The beloved community is a principle, not an argumentum ad populum. The beloved community does not belong to any particular party, religion, or racial group. The beloved community has no ideology except that love is sufficient for community building. The beloved community is not interested in membership rosters, followers on Twitter, or any other indicator of influence. It is a deliberate effort by deliberate people to live deliberate lives together toward deliberate goals. In today's society, membership is valued at the expense of service, connection, obligation, etc. Also on the rise is slacktivism, the ability to simply sign on to movements without any actual connection between the people involved. The beloved community means that I can call on you, the one I know can do X, to do X, while I, the one everyone else in the community knows can do Y, to do Y. There is no beloved community in which a given individual can passively be a member. Everyone in the beloved community bears gifts that are freely given to the community. The beloved community is indeed a local phenomenon, and one can be in multiple beloved communities at the same time. Following Royce's view of pragmatism, here are 3 features of beloved communities that keep them from falling into the traps aforementioned. 1, beloved communities are voluntary. Whosoever will is Jesus's phrasing of voluntarism. No one can be forced into a beloved community, nor can anyone be forced to stay in one. Beloved communities require a willingness, a voluntas that animates the working together of individuals. Everyone has to have their hands on deck. 2, beloved communities are fallible. The beloved community has nothing figured out a priori to action. When something does not work, the beloved community changes its views in subsequent actions. It does not seek certainty, but community. It is not interested in being right. It is interested in whether everyone knows each other, whether everyone is vulnerable to the events of those in the community. 3, beloved communities are experimental. They seek to move us to unknown territory, new possibilities of living together, new ways to address old problems. The beloved community has a kind of nimbleness that resists old styles of codification. Beloved communities are communities of inquiry that consistently ask, what if we were to? With full awareness that tomorrow brings new ideas. The commitment is not to victory, but to staying together, to seeing an issue or struggle through, to sharing joys and sorrows together. Thus, the beloved community cannot be an idealistic Pollyannish vision. It is a pragmatic, historical, local effort that seeks to edify life together in a world so often defined in terms of monadic individualism. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Brad and Jacob. I am very happy for what you shared with us. And I think we have a couple minutes for you to, do either of you have a comment for the other before we get to some questions? Jacob, what did you hear?
Yeah, thank you. There's a running debate between Dr. Stone and I about the relationship between pragmatism and idealism. So my flags go up when he throws out idealism. And the reason for that is a Roycean reason, that ideals provide us with rules in our everyday lives, and that those rules can be very practical for negotiating the messiness. And so I tend to want to bring those two things together, those two isms together, idealism and pragmatism, rather than simply side with the pragmatic side. But if readers or if viewers are interested in that debate, we have our book, Introducing Prophetic Pragmatism, addresses or introduces and addresses that debate. So that's my initial response. And and you have to remember that we're both philosophers, so argument is friendship.
Brad,
Yeah.
any response to Jacob?
Yeah. Well, I mean, who doesn't love idealism? In an ideal world with ideal agents, philosophers live in a magical place where everyone is rational and everyone can reason correctly and follows what reason tells them. But as James Baldwin reminds us, people rarely act based on what they know. And so I don't have a problem with idealism per se, but the temptation is we start then arguing about what the ideal conditions ought to be, that we never get started in actually changing the world or interacting with each other. So we know this in philosophy. Philosophy winds up fighting on the particulars of the theory so that the action never happens. And so I'm always weary about idealisms. I prefer an experimental view. Now, some of that is Dr. Goodson is a more classical pragmatist, as we might say, and I'm what often is called a neo-pragmatist. So I'm already suspicious of idealisms because people then just sit around and argue those ideals. I'm much more of an experimentalist. The only way to know people is to actually know them. And that means knowing my racist neighbors. It means knowing that these are the things that our community is trying to accomplish. I can set aside the ideal conditions and instead go forward to improve my community. And so that's the big difference there. One of the key things I got out of Dr. Goodson's presentation is this concern about resentment. And I think that resentment might be the biggest obstacle to hope. Hope means that I actually have to get over certain resentments.
Yeah.
And as St. Paul said in this week's lectionary, for those who follow Revised Standard Lectionary, we are to let things go that are behind us and strive toward that which lies ahead. That's hope. Hope is being in an America that's so historically marked, for example, with racism, yet knowing that the overcoming of racism in America makes America fulfill its actual destiny, the destiny it has always had. America is an experiment. And so hope means that we can always try again. We can always say, this worked, that didn't work. How could I do something different today than what we did yesterday? And I think if we get rid of, this is where we start having some fun. Once we get rid of the ideal notion of what America should be, we can then get over the resentment so that we don't think we're losing something when we try something new. And so this question of resentment as an obstacle to hope, I think, is a very big issue.
Well, thank you. We have several questions. I'm just going to share one with you. I think this was in response to something that you said, Dr. Stone. Our cars know each other better than the people know each other. The question is, how do we rebuild the beloved community post-COVID?
Well, it is actually my hope, and more ministerially, I would say my prayer, that we did not lose communities during COVID. I know it happened, but I tend to think that that was more of an indicator of things not actually being community first. I gave a sermon a couple of weeks ago where I actually commented that if your church that you're part of stopped completely during COVID, you were never in a church. Not a church as a community, not church as agent of the gospel, because all we have now is a different context, not an ideal situation, to say the least. But that's where experimentalism comes in. So Zoom has been, for example, very useful in that regard, of forging communities that might have otherwise not been able to be forged, because now, particularly like in LA, traffic's no longer a factor. And now there's been many more opportunities to actually engage with each other than pre-COVID. So one of the things that my church is actually figuring out is, how are we going to use Zoom even once we're able to be back in person? Not as a simulcast of what we're doing in person, but some of the things we converted over to Zoom, like Bible study, for example. I've had more people at Bible study than I've ever had, in part because no one has anything else to do. But on the other hand, in LA, driving, let's say at 5:30 in the evening, makes you not want to drive to Bible study. So it just makes more sense for it to stay online. Sunday worship's easy because there's less traffic on Sunday, and so people can actually move around. So think about the kinds of communities like this event, forged inside of COVID, made possible, dare I say, because we could come together by Zoom. So the community has to be able to adapt to what the world throws at us. It will never be these ideal situations. So instead, we have to take whatever means we have available to us to continue meeting, continue conversing, continue interacting with each other. That's how I think we do that. And if anything, COVID teaches us how to do that.
Well, thank you. We're out of time for this. I want to thank both of you for sharing your current beloved communities and also your personal histories in terms of where you come from. And I think it's a celebration of people getting to know each other, that you two gentlemen coming from very different backgrounds have for the last 24 years maintained a friendship, which obviously is very productive. And we look forward to your work continuing together. Thank you, Jacob, and thank you, Brad. At this point, we're going to conclude this section on hope with the valedictory of John Lewis. And I think that is queued up and ready to go. It is.
Bill, we don't hear the audio on this. We're not hearing the audio.
Yeah, is Jace, Jace is responsible for this. Jace, can you get the audio going for us?
While my time here has now come to an end, I want you to know that in the last days and hours of my life, you inspired me. You filled me with hope about the next chapter of the great American story when you used your power to make a difference in our society. Millions of people motivated simply by human compassion laid down the burdens of division. Around the country and the world, you set aside race, class, age, language, and nationality to demand respect for human dignity. That is why I had to visit Black Lives Matter Plaza in Washington. Though I was admitted to the hospital the following day, I just had to see and feel it for myself that after many years of silent witness, the truth is still marching on. Emmett Till was my George Floyd. He was my Rayshard Brooks, Sandra Bland, and Breonna Taylor. He was 14 when he was killed, and I was only 15 years old at the time. I will never ever forget the moment when it became so clear that he could easily have been me. In those days, fear constrained us like an imaginary prison, and troubling thoughts of potential brutality committed for no understandable reason were the bars. Though I was surrounded by two loving parents, plenty of brothers, sisters, and cousins, their love could not protect me from the unholy oppression waiting just outside that family circle. Unchecked, unrestrained violence and government-sanctioned terror had the power to turn a simple stroll to the store for some Skittles or an innocent morning jog down a lonesome country road into a nightmare. If we are to survive as one unified nation, we must discover what so readily takes root in our hearts that could rob Mother Emanuel Church in South Carolina of her brightest and best, shoot unwitting concert goers in Las Vegas, and choke to death the hopes and dreams of a gifted violinist like Elijah McClain. Like so many young people today, I was searching for a way out, or some might say a way in. And then I heard the voice of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on an old radio. He was talking about the philosophy and discipline of nonviolence. He said we are all complicit when we tolerate injustice. He said it is not enough to say it will get better by and by. He said each of us has a moral obligation to stand up, and speak out. When you see something that is not right, you must say something. You must do something. Democracy is not a state. It is an act, and each generation must do its part to help build what we call the beloved community, a nation and world society at peace with itself. Ordinary people with extraordinary vision can redeem the soul of America by getting in what I call good trouble, necessary trouble. Voting and participating in the democratic process are key. The vote is the most powerful nonviolent change agent you have in a democratic society. You must use it because it is not guaranteed. You can lose it. You must also study and learn the lessons of history because humanity has been involved in this soul-wrenching existential struggle for a very long time. People on every continent have stood in your shoes through decades and centuries before you. The truth does not change. And that is why the answers worked out long ago can help you find solutions to the challenges of our time. Continue to build union between movements stretching across the globe because we must put away our willingness to profit from the exploitation of others. Though I may not be here with you, I urge you to answer the highest calling of your heart and stand up for what you truly believe. In my life, I have done all I can to demonstrate that the way of peace, the way of love and nonviolence is the more excellent way. Now it is your turn to let freedom ring. When historians pick up their pens to write the story of the 21st century, let them say that it was your generation who laid down the heavy burdens of hate at last, and that peace finally triumphed over violence, aggression, and war. So I say to you, walk with the wind, brothers and sisters, and let the spirit of peace and the power of everlasting love be your guide.
John Lewis's faith was incubated at Greater Dunn's Chapel in Troy, Alabama, his first beloved community. A community he returned to again and again, but along the way he was welcomed and taught and loved and instructed in many beloved communities. May each of us, in his memory and in the basking of this day, celebrate and support our beloved communities.
Thank you, Phil. That was fabulous. I know we're all feeling energized, and we know there are things that we want to do, but we may be wondering how to channel our energy. And we have one more speaker today who's going to help us with that. Christine Payne is a registered nurse, a member of the board of directors, and a volunteer at the Old Town Medical and Dental Center here in Williamsburg. She's a member of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council of the Virginia Nurses Association and a graduate of the Sorensen Institute's Political Leadership Program. She's going to provide us with a call to action as we leave today's event. The beloved community is not going to create itself. We need to do the work to make that happen. Christine?
Thank you, Karen. Good afternoon, everyone. Organizing this seminar has truly been a labor of love for us. I appreciate the inspirational words of all our speakers. Like keynote speaker Bishop Moore, I too have roots in Mount Vernon, New York, and have many loving memories of my grandparents' home there. Thanks to all of you who've dedicated your time today to participate in our interfaith gathering. As Karen mentioned, I'm a nurse, and on February 8th of this year, I received an email from the International Council of Nurses amplifying the World Health Organization's Global Health Emergency Declaration that spoke of a novel coronavirus. The ICN went a step further and acknowledged the coronavirus outbreak was spreading in pandemic proportions. At about the same time, we saw an uptick in our clinic patients who came in with fevers and severe flu-like symptoms, but were testing negative for the flu. By month's end, I was reading medical reports out of Italy and China, wearing a mask at the grocery store, and stocking up on cleaning supplies. Misinformation was rampant. Rumors and conspiracy theories proliferated on social media, pushing the bogus claim that African Americans were somehow immune to the disease. In reality, they were dying in disproportionate high rates. On February 23rd, Ahmaud Arbery, a young Black man, went for a run and never went home. He was hunted down and killed by two white men, a father and son, who thought he fit the description of a man who committed a recent crime. Virtual 5Ks popped up on social media, and we ran for Ahmaud because running is an expression of freedom of movement. And as Americans, we expect to be able to move freely. A week later, Sean Reed was killed by a police officer after a high-speed chase. At the time, in the tumult of the news cycle, the deaths of these Black men received little attention. By mid-March, Williamsburg-James City County made its way to number 11 on the global outbreak map, and we led our state in number of new COVID cases. Sentara Williamsburg Hospital had to borrow 4 ventilators from Hampton to meet the needs of their ICU patients. Friends were getting sick. We lost members of the faith community and loyal activists to the virus. My daughter, away at college, called to tell me that she and her roommates had been quarantined because of a potential exposure. My nephew got sick, really sick, with the virus, and people were arguing over whether to believe COVID-19 was a significant threat to public health or just a hoax perpetrated by the liberal media. We became polarized over the simple act of wearing a mask in public to protect each other. Also in March, 26-year-old Breonna Taylor, an EMT with hopes of becoming a nurse, was shot and killed in her home by police officers. And in May, with so much of the country on lockdown because of the pandemic, America watched in horror as George Floyd died under the weight of a police officer's knee on his neck. We are witness to 2 pandemics that have collided, the coronavirus and the plague of systemic racism that has so tragically and methodically been on display. COVID-19 and its impacts have shown a harsh light on racial and ethnic disparities and the systemic constructs that continue to oppress Black and Brown communities. Laid bare are the obstacles that stand in the way of an equitable distribution of health, resources, and treatment under the law. Communities are hurting, and we cannot be well while our neighbors continue to suffer. Ours is indeed a wounded world, but we are faithful people. Each and every one of us who has been called to this virtual space today is a believer. We may find ourselves at different points along the spiritual journey, but we are all at the same time both grounded and propelled by our faith. It is the base of our strength and the force that motivates us to act. We seek to realize a beloved community as we honor the victims of today's pandemics, draw from the strength and courage of our heroes, advocate for healthy communities, promote healing, and offer hope. Our activism takes many forms, and in the wake of this election season, a purposeful, collective response has never been more urgent. When, as a people of faith, we witness injustice, we cannot be silent. Our vote is our voice. In his final days, we heard John Lewis say, "The vote is the most powerful, nonviolent change agent that you have in a democratic society." Our activism sets the tone. It lays the groundwork for the policy changes we envision, but marches and rallies themselves will not bring about structural change. We must choose leaders who best reflect our values, leaders capable of moving us towards justice and fairness. In 2019, Virginians went to the polls and changed the balance of power in our General Assembly. That is how we ended predatory lending, kept firearms out of places of worship, ended discrimination in housing and hiring practices, passed the Equal Rights Amendment, and made it easier for all Virginians to vote. And now, during special session, we have our best shot at realizing impactful criminal justice and policing reform. Make no mistake, we will not see that kind of substantive change on the national level with a continuation of the current leadership in Washington. The interfaith community is by no means of a singular theology, but what we all have in common is the edict to be good and kind to each other. In Judaism, Hillel says, "If I am not for myself, who will be for me? But if I am only for myself, who am I?" For believers of Islam, Muhammad says, "None of you will have faith until you love your neighbor, until you love for your neighbor what you love for yourself." As a follower of Jesus, I am called to love my neighbor as myself and also to love my enemy. At the core of these great teachings is empathy, and empathy is the soul of morality. Our country is crying out for leaders who are capable of empathy. We are all members of both a civic and faith community. We must choose our leaders according to the dictates of our conscience. Voting is a moral imperative. I'm not suggesting that our faith leaders endorse a particular candidate, but faith communities are called to engage in voter education, voter registration, and helping congregants get to the polls. We look to our pastors and priests, rabbis and imams to intentionally empower their congregants, offer up voting as an act of agency, and encourage believers to vote as the teachings of our faith lead us. Voting is easier and more accessible this year than ever before in the state of Virginia. Thanks to our new state law, we're able to cast our votes early, in person, or by mail-in ballot. I've included in your seminar packet a voter guide created by the League of Women Voters in both English and Spanish. I'd like to take a few minutes to highlight some of those important points. And I'm hoping that we'll have the Interfaith share my screen.
We can see it, Christine.
Oh, okay, sorry, I can't. The confounds of technology, I apologize. Let's take a few minutes just to take a look at this. Who can vote? Let's talk about who can vote. Any individual who turns 18 on or before November 3rd who is a U.S. citizen may register to vote and vote after they receive their voter registration card. In Virginia, the last day to register is October 13th. It is important for you to communicate to your congregants that if their citizenship is not yet finalized, they will not They should not try to register or vote in this election. Doing so could put their path to citizen in serious jeopardy. When you vote, you must present identification, but because of a newly enacted law in Virginia, we are no longer obligated to show a picture ID. When you go to vote, you can take any acceptable form of identification, which includes your voter registration card, a utility bill, other documents that have your name and address on them, or a student ID. Of course, you can take your driver's license if you so choose. Virginians are now allowed to cast their votes 45 days prior to Election Day. For us, early voting began September 18th, and I know many of you, like myself, have already voted. Voting early runs through October 31st. Each county and city has established early voting locations and hours of operation, and you'll see on our flyer that the city of Williamsburg, James City County, and York County locations have been included. Additionally, you may request a ballot to be mailed to you by referring to the citizen portal at the bottom right of the flyer or calling your local registrar. Registration requests must be made by October 23rd and postmarked no later than November 3rd. And of course, your regular polling locations will be open on Election Day, November 3rd, from 6 a.m. to 7 p.m. I commend this flyer to you and your congregants. You are welcome to copy and distribute them as you wish. For the members of our virtual audience who live outside the Commonwealth, I would encourage you to visit vote411.org. That's vote411.org. It's an easily navigable website that can provide voting information specific to your communities. We know that each election is important, but this one is truly the most consequential of our lifetime. I implore each and every one of you to make a plan and cast your vote for the candidates whose values and guiding principles reflect those of the interfaith community. This is a time of reckoning for the people of faith in America as we engage in what is truly the battle for the soul of our nation. The choices we make now, between now and November 3rd, can be transformational. New leaders can provide the bridge that propels us from where we are now, a place of divisiveness, hate, and fear, to the place where we intend to be, a place of unity, love, and hope. But it is only by casting our votes in numbers too big to be ignored that we will get to that place. All of us have banked a good amount of relationship capital over the years. But now, in the midst of COVID-19, when we are compelled to physically distance, we run the risk of merely living off that interest. Let us invest in each other, honor the memories of the victims of the two pandemics by taking up the mantle of our heroes. Lean into our interconnectedness through faith as we move towards physical, economic, and spiritual healing. Ours is indeed a wounded world. We must choose the leaders who have the vision and a plan for healing and hope. Voting is our moral imperative. The fate of the beloved community is in our hands. Be well, everyone.
Thanks, Christine. This brings to an end the formal portion of our program. Thank you all so much for participating in this today. This has succeeded beyond what we thought it might be, and we thought it was going to be pretty good, and it's really been marvelous. Before we close, I do want to remind you of a few pieces of information to take away with you. You should have received an email with the handouts for today's event, including overviews of the presentations and the slide about voting. And later today, you'll receive a link to a survey where you'll have an opportunity to provide us with some feedback on the event. To close out today's activities, we've asked Rabbi Ellen Jaffe Gill, spiritual leader of Tidewater Havurah, a congregation without walls based in Virginia Beach. And she's also the contact person for the Hampton Roads chapter of the Virginia Interfaith Center for Public Policy. We've asked her to offer a closing prayer. Her words will end this event with no further comments from me. After a brief pause, I'll close this meeting, but the interaction begun here will continue. This meeting has been recorded and you'll be sent a link, including to the chat box with all the wonderful thoughts that you've shared. So on behalf of the James River chapter of the Virginia Interfaith Center, I thank you, and I ask Rabbi Ellen to offer our closing prayer. Ellen?
Thank you, Karen. I offer a poem by Alden Sullivan, who is a very prolific writer of poetry that is incorporated widely into Jewish liturgy. And in fact, this was what I read at the closing of our recent Yom Kippur service. Let us dream wildly unimaginable blessings, blessings so unexpected, blessings so beyond our hopes for this world, blessings so unbelievable in this era that their very existence uplifts our vision of creation, our relationships to each other, and our yearning for life itself. Let us dream wildly unimaginable blessings, a complete healing of mind, body, and spirit, a complete healing for all, the end of suffering and strife, the end of plague and disease, when kindness flows from the river of love, when goodness flows from the river of grace, awakened in the spirit of all beings, when God's light, radiating holiness, is seen by everyone. Let us pray with all our hearts for wildly unimaginable blessings, so that God will hear the call to open the gates of the garden, seeing that we haven't waited, that we've already begun to repair the world. In testimony to our faith in life, our faith in each other, and our faith in the Holy One. Blessed be God's name. And we say together, Amen.